Isn't that when you're supposed to switch to a pool for training?
Yeah, we just left the pools, and then we've been doing Lake Washington, and it's got to be 61 or 62. It was cold. My hands were cramping by the time I finished this morning.
Where do you swim, Craig?
We leave Madison Park, and we swim to the Washington Tennis Club. So it's a mile down and a mile back, just along the shore.
Yeah.
But, yeah, after a mile, my hands were getting really cold.
And you're not in a boat.
No, we're in a wetsuit. We're in a swimsuit, swimming wetsuit. But your face,
you have to.
Your face, hands, and feet get a little cold.
Okay, looks like everyone's here. Let's go ahead and call the meeting to order. Good morning, everyone. We are ready to move into agenda item C4, and we'll have Council Staff John McCracken tell us what we're up to today.
Good morning, Mr. Chairman, members of the Council, John McCracken, Council staff. So what we're going to do is the team is going to walk us through a presentation on another initial review of the Sprawl CV COD analysis for cooperative program. And it is going to be very similar, not so much the slide, but the presentation's logistics will be pretty much the same as we saw at the December meeting. Daryl and I will be leading off. We'll be walking you through the background section and the elements and options, and then the first part of the effects section. And then Dr. Mike Downs will present the SIA, and then Miss Abby John will provide an overview of the enforcement or the monitoring and enforcement section, and finally picking up the end will be Dr. Joe Krieger, who will provide a summary of the EA. So here's a roadmap of the presentation. So you'll see a brief history of the action thus far, and then we'll pull up a couple slides on the strawman alternatives, and then we'll walk through kind of what's in the background section, as well as slowing down in the background section and talking a little bit about the reallocation, because that section has been increased based on, has been improved, as well as a lot more information provided based on what the council was looking for. And then, as I indicated, Daryl and I will walk through the elements and options section, and then, that will include highlighted issues and staff assumptions needing council clarification and direction. And that is summarized in section 2.2 starting on page 52. And then obviously, as we're going through the elements and options, we'll try to highlight those issues that need your clarification or direction. And then we'll have, again, a brief overview of the effects section. So in December of last year, staff presented an initial review of the analysis to refresh your memory. Council modified the purpose and need to include a minimized bycatch to the extent practicable, and adjusted several of the options and the elements. And all that information is in section 2.2 and 2.4 starting on page 30. Staff has also prepared a bulletized list of major changes in the document since December 2020 and review, and that is provided in section 2.3.4 starting on page 32. This was a AP data request. I'm not going to go through this. It just tells you what they asked for after the December meeting and where this information is located in the document. There's 2 slides that summarize what's in the straw man alternatives. This slide addresses alternative 2A. I'm sure most of you have had a chance to read through this information, so unless there's further questions, I'm not going to walk through the different pieces of alternative 2A on this slide, as well as 2B in this straw man alternative. Looking at a description of the fisheries, so this section provides obviously the necessary background information for the RIR, what is new or revised since the December 2020 presentation. So there's a section that deals with the management of trawl CV ICA. This is in section 2.7.2 on page 52. National Marine Fisheries Service wrote that up. Thank you for that. They were also very integral into providing a lot of information in the next section, which is the reallocations among the gear types, and this is in section 2.7.3, starting on page 54. And again, that's the section that I'll go through, hopefully somewhat briefly, just to highlight what new information is in there and what we found. There is the affected sectors, or the indirectly and directly impacted sectors, includes the pot CVs greater than 60 feet. That's a new addition based on a request from the AP. The community information was updated, and CDQ ownership interest relevant to the 12 CVs was added, and that's in section 2.7.9, starting on page 104, and Dr. Downs will walk you through that when he provides the SIA information. So there's a note here at the bottom of this that since publication, we received some input about section 2.7.8, the product composition and flow of Pacific cod through the world markets, to include information on the cod production by shore-based processors in the Bering Sea Aleutian Islands in the next iteration. And we plan on doing that, making that information more focused on the shoreside processors in the Bering Sea Aleutian Islands. And in general, when we looked at the information after the information was after discussions after the document was published, we found that shoreside processors in the last 5 years have in fact shifted away from H&G product forms to more value-added product forms like fillets. So no questions so far. We'll move to the reallocation of cod, again in section 2.7.3. So in general, reallocation from the inshore sector would be reallocated primarily to other inshore sectors before reallocated to offshore sectors, and secondly, within a gear type before reallocated to another gear type. And what we found was that A season allocations are usually fully harvested. Any remaining A season is rolled to the next season, so reallocations of A season are rare. The one exception is the jig sector, where any projected unused portion of the seasonal allowance is required to be reallocated to the under 60-foot group. NMFS provided information on how they do reallocations, and they strive to reallocate projected unharvested cod to sectors that may be able to harvest these amounts. However, that decision and the process by which reallocations happen is a complex, and many factors aren't taken into consideration. One of the primary considerations is not to reallocate cod from a sector that may have the capacity to catch their allocation, or catch their allocation. Through the decision process and the communication with vessel operators and processors, sometimes cod does remain uncaught at the end of the year. So there's some examples of consideration that the NMFS looks at. For the jig, they determine the jig sector's plans and how much the seasonal allocation may be reallocated to the under 60-foot group. For the hook and line CV greater than 60, for many years, little or no cod directed fishing took place, and usually all the remaining cod was reallocated to the hook and line / pot sector under 60 group. The pot CV greater than or equal to 60 from 08 to 17 there was large amounts of projected unharvested cod in that sector that was reallocated to the under 60-foot group, and other sectors, mostly the pot CP sectors. However, in recent years, projected unused cod has decreased considerably. For the trawl CV and the AFACP sector, depending on the remaining tax near November 1st, NIMS determines if the two sectors will have remaining CCs in cod and what sectors might be able to use that projected unharvested cod. So we looked at a bunch of data, and so the first three tables in this section, 2.5, 2.6, and 2.7, show the annual reallocation amounts by cod, or of cod by sector. And the way we prepared these tables is the table 2.5 are sectors that annually reallocated cod, and table 2-7 is composed of sectors that were net receivers, and the middle table 2.6 was those sectors that kind of went back and forth a little bit throughout the 2004 to 2019 period. So the sectors that annually reallocated cod were the trawl CV sector, the pot CV sector then greater than 60, jig, and the hook and line CV greater than 60. Overall, trawl CVs on average had the largest portion of the reallocation at 43%. And what we found for those that were net receivers, the hook and line CP, the under 60-foot group, and the pot CPs were obviously sectors that were net receivers on an annual basis. The under 60-foot group on average received the largest share at 40%. Table 2-8, starting on page 61, provides the trawl CV seasonal cod directed fishing days, the initial allocation, reallocations amount, total catch, seasonal allocation revised after reallocation, and the remaining seasonal allocation after deducting the total catch. So there's a lot of information in that table. And again, National Fish Service was very helpful. They're the ones that prepared this table. So I want to thank them on the record. So seasonal overages and under harvest often occur in the A season. Some of the reasons include incidental catch rates after closure dates are higher or lower than projected. Catch rates were higher or lower than projected, resulting in closures that are a day or two early or too late. And severe weather can also play a part, as some vessels let me start again on that bullet. Severe weather can slow some vessels, but not others, which changes the projected catch rates. Overall, after adjusting for reallocation, the trawl CV sector tended to finish each year with a small amount of cod unharvested. Reallocations occurred during the C season, except for in 2011 when 1,300 metric tons was reallocated in May. And NIMS subtracted cod from the A season and B season, but was not reallocated until the C season, only in 3 years during the 04 to 19, and that was 2015, 16, and 19. The last table that I'll talk about in the reallocation section is 2.9, page 63, which provides annual reallocation of cod from the trawl CV sector to other sectors from 04 to 2020. Again, this table was prepared by National Fisheries Service, and it was in direct request by the council. So the largest portion of reallocation cod was to the hook and line CP sector at 41%, which contributed to 38% of that sector's total reallocation that they received. The M80 sector was next at 23%, which amounted to 94% of that sector's total reallocation. And the hook and line, or I should say the under 60-foot group, was third at 20%, which contributed to 27% of that sector's total reallocation during the 04 to 19 period. The primary reason for the hook and line CP, Amendment 80, and the AFACP sectors receiving reallocation was due to high cod tax in the early parts of the 2000 period, which resulted in CVs being at their harvest capacity. So cod was reallocated to CPs since they had a little bit more capacity to harvest that reallocation. There were only 2 secondary reallocations that happened, and they were from the AFACP sector to the Amendment 80 sector. So, Mr. Chairman, I'll move to the analysis of the elements and options.
Well, Mr. McCracken, let's pause for questions here. Ms. Baker.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. McCracken, I have a question about this bullet on this slide compared to a metric that you had earlier. The first bullet here says the largest portion of reallocated COD was to the hook and line CP sector at 41%, and then you go through the other sectors. That's the total amount. That 41% is the proportion of the total amount of COD that was reallocated over the time period you looked at, because I'm remembering a previous slide that said something about the under 60 hook and line and tot CV sector being the largest receiver of COD at 40%. Was that 40% of their allocation? Can you help me reconcile those two metrics on those two slides, please?
Madam Chair, Ms. Baker, sure. So the first set of tables that I went through that talk about the net receivers and the net providers of reallocation, all those proportional numbers there are looking at what all the sectors contribute to. So, for example, the under 60-foot group, they're 40%. That amount, that percentage is based on both JIG and the trawl CV and any other sectors that are reallocating COD to the under 60-foot group. With regards to the numbers in Table 2.2-9, we are only looking at, for the most part, we're looking at just what the trawl CV sector reallocates to other sectors. So we're narrowing in the focus, and we're now looking at the flow of COD and how it flows from the trawl CV's allocation. They're 22.1%. If they don't harvest it, how that flows to all the other sectors. So that first bullet there, the largest portion of reallocated COD for the hook and line CP on Table 2-9 is 41%. That's 41% of the entire trawl CV reallocation. And then the second percentage in that statement is then what we do is we look at the hook and line CP total reallocation, and then we try to we figure out how much of the trawl CV reallocation contributes to the total that the hook and line CP got, and that's where the 38% comes in. Mr. Chairman, Ms. Baker, how does that address your issue or your question?
Thanks, Mr. McCracken. That is helpful. And I do have one more question about something that's in the analysis in this section, and I believe something that you mentioned in your presentation that, as shown in Table 2-8, that seasonal overages and underages often occur in the A season. And I'm wondering if you can provide a little more context to that statement, because does that mean over the entire time period that you were looking at for this analysis, so 2004 to 2020? I'm looking at Table 2-8. I'm just trying to get at I guess this reallocation section really gets at how we manage COD in the Bering Sea and Aleutian Islands, and that statement in the analysis struck me that seasonal overages and underages often occur in the A season. So is that a relatively new phenomenon that you're referring to, or is that something that's generally occurred over the time period that we're looking at?
Madam Chair, Ms. Baker, I think if you look through Table 2-8, you look to the far right, you can kind of see on an annual basis where there's a parenthetical, which would obviously mean that there was they went over their A season allocation. It would obviously come from then it would be deducted from the B season. And you can see there that, for instance, in 2004, they over-harvested by 2,000 metric tons. 2005, they were under by 113, so forth and so on throughout the whole process. So it looks like it fluctuates back and forth throughout the whole set of years and doesn't seem to have any particular trend that I can see in looking at. But overall, when you factor in the B season and the C season, taking into account overages and underages, in general, we find that there's a little bit of COD left over after the end of the year, factoring in all three seasons numbers.
Thanks for that. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Ms. Baker. Mr. Down.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, John. And I'm looking at this table 2.9 here, and I'm just wanting to clarify something to make sure I'm looking at this correctly. So when I'm looking at table 2.9 and then I'm looking at your reallocation of cod slide that you have here, we're looking at a very wide range of years from 2004 to 2020. So in 2000, when you look at that wide range, then you look at the hook and line pot CVs less than 60 feet as kind of taking 20% of the reallocations, or 27% of the sector's total reallocation. When I'm looking at that, when I look at more recent history, I think it seems to indicate to me that's shifted very dramatically in recent years to the hook and line CPs are in 2018, 2019, and 2020 were 0%, for instance, and the hook and line pot CVs less than 60 in recent years have been 43% and 60%. And then I got another question on 2020. I just wanted to verify that. But is that right? Is that the way I'm looking at this, that there's been a dramatic shift in where these reallocations are ending up?
Mr. Chairman, Dr. Mr. Downs, yes, dramatic. I would just say there appears to be a shift. And obviously, the earlier years there was a larger, obviously, peacock tack. So, and thus I pointed out already that when the National Fish Service does reallocations, they look at the ability to harvest that that additional cod that's going to be rolled over to another sector. And so obviously with greater amounts of tack in the early 2000 period, and the harvest, the catcher vessel sectors being not having the capacity, most of that cod was reallocated to, as you can see there, the hook and line CP sector, and less so as we get narrower and narrower down to the latter part of 2020, 2019, 2018. There's very little tack compared to the early parts of 2000. So the considerations that National Fisheries takes into consideration for reallocation shifts a little bit, and obviously the catcher vessels at those smaller quantities have a little bit more capacity to take on reallocations, or so that I think that's kind of what you're seeing there.
Yeah, and then another follow-up question. So when I'm looking at the AFA CPs on that table, I noticed they had their allocations were at 0% for quite a few years, and then in 2020 they had 100% of the reallocation of cod went to the AFA CPs. I'm assuming that's to cover the overage from their allocation. In other words, these were fish that were caught after their allocation had been exceeded and were discarded, and that was necessary to cover those overages, and 100% of what was available was needed to cover the overages in the AFA CP fleet. Would that be correct?
Mr. Chairman, Mr. Downs, yes, that is correct. Obviously, overages are the primary consideration when reallocations are taken into consideration. The overages must be taken care of first before reallocation to other sectors. So that's why you're seeing the trawl CV reallocation of 1,014 metric tons in 2020.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Mr. McCracken.
Thanks, Mr. Down.
Yeah.
Okay, Mr.
All
McCracken.
right. So moving to walking through the elements and options, starting on element 1, cooperative style. So the cooperative style that, in this element is voluntary harvest cooperatives with processor association. And just as a reminder, in December, the Council removed from consideration the 2 cooperative model, which was the AFA, non-AFA, due to the challenges this cooperative style poses and how it would integrate with the processors if processors were allocated harvester shares. On the voluntary harvest cooperative selection includes two options for cooperative formation as a reminder. First is a no limitation on the number of LLPs or the percent of catch history. The second approach is 3 eligible LLP licenses. Harvesters have unlimited discretion to choose any cooperative and may freely move among those cooperatives annually. And cooperatives form with an licensed processor in association. A licensed processor includes shoreside, stationary floating processors, motherships, and CPs acting as a motherships, which would be limited to those authorized to act as a mothership in the Bering Solution Island trawl CB cod fishery. There's also an option that includes requiring 3 unique LLP license holders to form a cooperative using the 10% ownership rule. And using that rule and using address as the proxy, staff estimates that there could be as a maximum of 10 to 11 different cooperatives, but likely cooperative formation would be less than that. The number of cooperatives would be less than that. Element 2 is allocation of LLP licenses. So in December, the council clarified that catch history for allocations will not be considered beyond December 31st, 2019. Elements 2.1 and 2.2. Element 2.2 provides 3 different sets of years for eligibility. Eligibility is any license that authorize the vessel's legal landings of targeted trawl CV cod during the qualifying years. Targeted cod catch history during the qualifying years would be assigned an LLP license as QS. The trawl CV that holds the valid LLP license to use trawl gear in the Bering Sea but does not have QS assigned to that LLP license, they could still obviously harvest cod as incidental catch in other fisheries but could not target cod in the Bering Sea. In December, the council included a new option that would apply a minimum threshold percentage range of 0.25% to 1% by LLP license holder for eligibility to receive harvest shares. This option would not apply to the 8 non-AFA trawl CV LLP licenses that are less than 60 feet that have AI transferable endorsements. So how I provided a couple of examples on how this option would work. So at a 0.25% threshold, an LLP license holder with only one license with less than 0.25% QS would not qualify for quota share. That's pretty obvious and easy to understand. Building up and using multiple licenses. So at 0.25% threshold again, an LLP license with 3 LLP licenses for a total of QS of 0.5. All 3 licenses would qualify even if each of the individual LLPs were below the 0.25 threshold. And then in the analysis, there are some further examples that consider partial ownership. And we did find that when you do include partial ownership, it adds a level of complexity to the eligibility process. And I think that, from staff's perspective, we would like to see some clarification if partial ownership of LLP license should be applied if this option were to move forward. Table 2-78 on page 153 provides the number of the LLP licenses, average annual qualified landings in metric tons, and the remaining LLP licenses allocation as a percent of the original allocation they would receive at the different minimum threshold percentages by the LLP license holder and LLP license. So what this table shows is, go to it right now. So you can see there, if you were looking at it at 0.25% using 2014 to 2019, 8 LLP licenses, when you're applying it by the license holder, would not qualify for QS, and the average annual qualifying landings of those 8 LLP licenses is 300 metric tons. which the resulting effect of those LLP licenses that are still would continue to qualify for QS, their allocation is about 1% more as a result of the 8 LLP licenses not qualifying. And you can apply that example throughout the whole table. The table is divided into 2 parts. The top part is the LLP license holder, and staff included as a comparison by LLP license itself rather than just the holder. And you can see the contrasting effects of both by LLP holder and LLP license.
Mr. McCracken, Ms. Kimball has a question.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. McCracken, I just wanted to make sure I was reading that column on the table correctly, that you walked through the qualifying landings associated with that number of license holders. That's not the cumulative amount of metric tons that those, in your example, 8 licenses hold. That's the average that each license holds. I just wanted to make sure I was understanding that correctly.
That is the average qualifying landings of those 8 LLP licenses, yes, in that example. So 300 metric tons is their average.
And then quick follow-up, Mr. Chair, there's a, on the second part of the table showing by LLP license, I noticed in the previous slide you were underlining holder, and I didn't know if I should be reading something into this comparison, as in if the council is interested in this kind of an option, we should be looking at it a different way than is expressed in the current motion, or is this just to show the comparison between license holders and licenses, and you're not looking for further clarification on whether it applies at the license holder level?
Madam, or Mr. Chairman and Ms. Kimball, no, I'm not looking for further information. Staff's was not the intent. We just included this information for the sake of analysis and comparison and contrasting the different approaches.
Okay, appreciate that. Thanks.
Let's see. Okay, so moving to element 2.2, provides 3 different sets of years for eligibility. And I think that this is more of a reminder slide than anything else. You've seen this information in December. For purposes of efficiency, I just kind of highlight that tables 2-79 through 2-81 on pages 155 through 157 provide the distribution of the qualified landings in quintile groupings based on the options and elements. 2.2.4 is the blend allocation, and again, this information is exactly what you saw at the December meeting, and I would just point to the fact that this option is intended to address the bearing solution on COD AFA sideboard leases within the AFA cooperatives via civil contracts. It would only apply to those eligible LLP licenses affiliated with AFA vessels restricted by these COD sideboard limits in the Bering Sea Aleutian Islands. The blend option would not be applied to AFA sideboard exempt vessels and non-AFA vessels. They would be removed from this process and would be held harmless. The LLP licenses on the non-AFA CVs at the time of implementation would be allocated a portion of their trawl CV QS using a blend of their 1997 sideboard history and the targeted COD during the qualifying years, which is option 2.2.1 through 2.2.3. And there are 3 different ratios for blending. You can see there on the slide. Just a note here at the very end of the slide that it was discovered after the publishing of the analysis that the denominators for the blend options do not match the denominators of the non-blended option. All the denominators for both blended and non-blended should match. So we went back and looked at the blended denominators, and we have found a couple of minor errors, and we corrected it. And so the next iteration of the blend tables for the October meeting will be adjusted and fixed. In December, the council included a transferable AI endorsements on the non-AFA Trawl CV LLP licenses to receive QS. A transferable AI endorsement authorizes the vessel signed to the LLP license to legally fish in the Aleutian Islands with trawl gear for cod, even though the LLP license itself is lacking an AI endorsement. This authorization came from a Amendment 9282 that was implemented on September 14th of 2009, which awarded these 8 AI endorsements. These 8 LLP licenses met the eligibility criteria for this action to harvest they had to at least harvest 500 metric tons of cod in the AI parallel fishery during the 2000 through 2006 period. Table 2-83 on page 160 provides the annual AI target activity from 04 to 19 for these LLP licenses. Given that the September 14, 2019 implementation date, the target AI cod in the parallel fishery during the 04 to September 14, 2009 would not count towards their QS or the PCTC program. Using the AI targeted cod from September 15 to 09 to 2019, which would apply, shows that only 5 of these 8 LLP licenses using the transfer endorsements would qualify for QS. If the AI targeted cod from 04 to September 14th, 09 were authorized for the PCTC program for these 8 LLP licenses, then all 8 LLP licenses using AI transfer endorsements would qualify under option 2.2.3, which again is the broadest set of years, 2004 to 2019. If the council selected option, just a note there that there's a corollary option in element 6 that all 8 of the LLP licenses would be able to join a cooperative and harvest cod allocated to the AI cooperative associated with the AI shore plant, regardless if they qualified for QS under element 2.2. Under element 2.2. Tables 2-84 and 85 on 160, 161 provide the distribution of qualified AI transfer endorsements using target catch during the qualifying year options with and without qualifying years in the AI transfer endorsement. So the rest of element 2, just a reminder what's in there. Element 2.3 addresses stacked multiple LLP licenses on a vessel. Element 2.4 provides direction for each license will be issued BSAI COD CQ based on its share of COD QS and CQ and would not be designated a seasonal or sub-area level. 2.5 is an option that would only allocate A and B season QS, leaving the C season at which is 15% of the trawl CV allocation as a limited access fishery. There's a note here in bold. The council may want to remove the first, and actually I think there's 2 parentheticals in that 2.5 that the council may want to remove. These are linked to the cooperative option 1.1 that was removed in December, which, reminder, is the AFA, non-AFA cooperative approach, and that was removed at the December meeting. So there wouldn't be there would not be an allocation to the TLAS to the limited access fishery in this particular case for the A and B season. It would all be allocated to the co-ops with some amount for ICA. Element 2.6 addresses the management of groundfish species not allocated. And so, Mr. Chairman, I'm going to move up.
Ms. Kimball.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, Mr. McCracken. I just want to make sure I understood the take-home on your previous slide, that if on those 8 AI-endorsed licenses, one of the staff clarifications asked for in the document is clarifying whether parallel fishery deliveries were included. Is the take-home from the slide that only applies if the council selects a series of years under element 2 that's prior to 2009?
Madam Chair, Mr. Chairman, too much AP in me. To get to, let's see. So I provided, I'm looking for a slide here. Here we go. So not, Mr. Chairman, Ms. Kimball, not necessarily. So if you look at Table 2-85, if you picked up, if you authorize the ability of these 8 LLP licenses to use their activity in the parallel fishery before they had the transferable endorsement, and that would be from 04 to September 14th, 2009, and you selected 2009 or 2019 or 2014 to 2019, the selection of 2009 to 2019 would impact 3 of those LLP licenses. So 2 of them would qualify if you selected 2009 to 2019, leaving 1 that would not qualify. So 7 would qualify for QS under a 2009 to 2019. If you selected obviously 2004 to 2019, all 8 would qualify. And obviously if you selected 2014 to 2019, as I've already indicated, only 5 would qualify. Mr. Chairman, Ms. Kimball, does that answer your question?
Yes, I think it does. Thanks.
Thanks, Ms. Kimball. Mr. Merrill.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Mr. McCracken. I just wanted to, if you could advance 1 slide, please.
Sure.
Oops, sorry. I meant, yes. When you mentioned that catch history, you would have qualifying catch history based on whether or not you made legal landings in either the Bering Sea or the Aleutian Islands, but that it could be used once that quota is issued. The cooperative could choose to use that in either the Bering Sea or the Aleutian Islands. I wanted to clarify in terms of that actual qualifying catch history, the results in quota share. Are we still operating under assumptions that any catch that's made within a specific regulatory area needs to be made under the authority of a license that's qualifying for that regulatory area? How is that treated in the analysis, or what's the assumption that you made on that?
Mr. Chairman, Mr. Merrill, that is the assumption for QS to be assigned to an LLP license. The area that authorizes that vessel to participate in harvest in the Pacific cod in that area, that LLP license with that endorsement gets that QS. That is how this whole program is based and built up. Mr. Chairman, Mr. Merrill, does that get at your question?
It does. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Merrill. Ms. Baker.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. And I kind of tried a new strategy with this so as not to interrupt John. I sort of have a few questions about Element 2, various things in Element 2. So I kind of held them till the end. So I hope that's okay to try not to interrupt the presentation. So I have a question about the option for a minimum LLP license threshold in Element 2. And the analysis suggests that the requirement to have a minimum of 3 unique LLP licenses could potentially work to inhibit cooperative formation, particularly if there's a new processor that would like to enter the program, or I think in reference to harvesting quota LLP license holders that have divergent views perhaps from cooperatives. So having that minimum requirement of 3 LLP licenses could potentially inhibit cooperative formation. And so that was, my first question is the key word there unique LLP licenses? Because, and was that sort of based, that having trouble with words this morning, is that sort of discussion in the analysis based on the fact that on the understandably sort of high level analysis that staff did on the addresses of LLP license holders, for example, 2014 through 2019, yielded 31 unique addresses of the 85 eligible LLP licenses. So obviously, in that statement, unique seems to make a big difference in terms of the potential for cooperative formation if the council required 3 unique LLP licenses. And so I was wondering, if the council is concerned about inhibiting cooperative formation with an option like we have in front of us right now, and we instead go with no minimum number of licenses required, wouldn't that allow for a cooperative of 1 LLP license holder, basically, if there are no minimum licenses required? And so is it possible maybe the council would want to think about something in between those 2 options, maybe between 0 and 3? Would that potentially be helpful?
Mr. Chairman, Ms. Baker, that was the original context of which staff brought that up back in December. The original motion did say 3 LLP license holders, and staff, when we were looking at this and analyzing it, there was some, we felt it was necessary to bring it up to the council's during our presentation that it is possible that to build a cooperative with 3 LLP licenses all owned by the same company. And so therefore staff wanted to highlight that issue, that did you mean, when you said that, did you mean 3 LLP licenses held by, for example, 1 company, which then results in, for example, again, getting back to having no limitations, because we were contrasting that. The 3 was built to staff, was built in contrast to no limitations. And so staff figured we would highlight that issue because you could still fall into the same situation where you could have 1 co-op with 1 company owning all 3 of those licenses. And so we flagged that as an issue for consideration by the council. And we looked at addresses as a way to try to figure out how many, as a proxy, how many individual companies were out there. And based on all the information we could obtain, or would obtain based on the data we had, it looked to be 10 to 11 different co-ops could form under a 3 unique criteria. And so it is possible, I think, if without the word unique included in there, that you could create, as I've already indicated, a cooperative of 1 company. But there is sort of a restriction here, and that is the association with processors. So you obviously can't have unlimited, I don't think, and maybe it's theoretically possible, but I don't think in reality it would work, where you could have 40 different co-ops if you have totally unlimited number of LLP licenses or percentage of Ketcher Street to form a co-op, because you do have a limited number of processors. So I think that given that dynamic, that's kind of what that's the context of which staff can provide into 3 unique LLP licenses. And I would actually, given the uniqueness of this question, if Mr. Brannon wants to add a little bit more information or context, that totally is appropriate, I think.
Good morning, Mr. Chairman. Just to briefly summarize Ms. Baker's question, I think there are a couple issues. There's the issue of unique LLP license versus unique LLP license holders, and I think that's been covered pretty well looking at the numbers that Ms. Baker cited, that it appears that individuals hold several LLP licenses. The question of whether the council would wish to consider a range between one LLP license holder or one LLP license and three LLP license holders because of the problems in cooperative formation, I think is something that we could certainly look at in the next version of the analysis. So if the council wished to select an option that said there had to be two unique LLP license holders to form a cooperative, to avoid the situation where a single LLP license holder could essentially have an IFQ holding on their quota share, that's something that we would be happy to look at in the next version of the analysis. And since it falls within the range that the council is considering, I think we could either have a specific option that the council wants us to look at, or we could talk about it in more detail in the next version, whatever the council's preference would be.
Thank you for that, both of you. I appreciate that. That's really helpful. My second question, sorry to go back to the transferable Aleutian Islands endorsements, but I want to step back a little bit from the questions we've already had related to those, because I think this can be difficult. This can be a difficult issue to follow. I think the important point, if I'm understanding it correctly, is that the reason that the parallel fishery history related to the vessels at the time was not credited for qualifications for this PCTC program is that because at the time those landings were made between 2004 and September 24th, 2009, the vessels making that catch in the parallel fishery were not assigned to federal LLP licenses. Is that correct?
Mr. Chairman, Ms. Baker, yeah, that's correct. Since they didn't have a LLP with the correct AI endorsement, any catch during that 2004 to September 14, 2009 that happened in the parallel fishery is not considered legal catch for the purposes of assigning catch history to an LLP license. So it would not qualify without the council modifying the motion to authorize that activity for purposes of assigning QS to the LLP license. Or in this case, signing the QS to the AI and transferable endorsement, because that's what the motion, it wouldn't be transferring it to the license, it would be transferring it to the transferable endorsement.
Thank you for that, and that just got a little confusing, and so really the difference, because for the main calculation of catch history for purposes of the PCTC program, if a vessel was assigned to an LLP license and had parallel fishery catch during the relevant qualifying years, that would have contributed without the council specifying that. Is that correct?
Mr. Chairman, Ms. Baker, yes, that is correct.
Okay, thank you. And then, Mr. Chair, if I may, I have one more question on element 2.
Sure, Ms. Baker.
Thank you. This has to do with, sorry, just looking through my motion here, element 2.5, and the option to allocate A and B season Charles CV Pacific cod only. As I was thinking about this and reading the analysis on this section, we talked about the allocations of Pacific cod to the sea season, that under this option would remain a limited access fishery. I don't see in the council motion or the analysis that we have addressed apportionments of PSC we address it for the A and B seasons that would be rationalized under this option, but not for the C season that I can find. Is that correct?
Mr. Chairman, Ms. Baker, that is correct. It is a little bit of an oversight since we didn't point it out in the analysis, but there is a little bit of a disconnect, I believe, from staff's perspective, that if you were to select element 2.5 and only allocate A and B season and leaving the C season as a TLAS fishery, that the halibut and the crab PSC in element 3 speaks to only would be allocated as to the cooperatives, I should say. So first, it breaks down PSC between the two sectors that share the TLAS PSC, which was the trawl CV sector and the AFACP sector, but then taking the trawl CV portion and then distributing it or apportioning it to the cooperatives. So that all assumes that, for the most part, we would be allocating A, B, and C season. So there is a little bit of a disconnect that would obviously, with absent any action from the council at this point, we would have to address likely in element 3, as well as putting a note in element 2.5 to see element 3. I could go on, and I could talk about some different approaches that could be utilized, but I will stop there to see if there's any further follow-on questions.
Thank you for that, Mr. McCracken. I think I'll just stick with that for right now and think about that a little bit as we go forward and listen to your presentation and get testimony. Thank you very much, Mr. Chair.
All right, thank you, Ms. Baker.
Okay, Mr. Chairman, seeing no further questions from on element 2, we'll proceed to element 3, which is the prohibited species limits. So element 3 would, as I've already indicated when talking about element 2.5, would apportion halibut and crab PSC between the trawl CV sector and the AFACP sector based on historical use during the qualifying years. Option 3.1 maintains the flexibility for the council to leave crab PSC at the TLAS level. Option 3.2 would establish separate halibut and crab PSC limits for the trawl CV sector, and then further reduce PSC limits up to a maximum of 35%. Table 2-101 on page 182 provides the percent of halibut PSC apportioned to each sector using the 3 qualifying years from element 2. And table 102 on page 183 provides the percent of crab PSC usage for each sector during the 3 qualifying years from element 2. Option 3.2, in addition to apportioning PSC limits to the trawl CV sector, it would also reduce the halibut and crab PSCs, as I've already indicated. Looking at those reductions and looking at historical usage by the trawl CV sectors, we made some fairly simple statements here, where at a 10% reduction and assuming a 391 metric ton trawl limited access apportionment of halibut would yield anywhere from 339 to 344 metric tons, depending on the qualifying years. And that, looking at that past history of what the trawl CV sector looked at in a TLAS type fishery and not a cooperative program, would have constrained that sector in 2012 and 2019. Looking at the 35% reduction, again assuming a 391 metric ton halibut apportionment for the Pacific cod fishery, would yield anywhere from 245 to 248 metric tons, And when comparing that to usage, again, as a TLAS fishery and not a cooperative type managed fishery, the sector would have been constrained 11 years out of 16 years. Before I move on to crab, I would like to just note that your tables your usage tables as well as, your usage tables for the trawl CV and the AFA-CP sector determine splitting the cod and as well as comparing cod usage pollock usage, halibut usage in the cod fishery under the reductions. It does not include 2020 and 2021, and staff has indicated in the AP as well. We are planning on adding 2020 and 2021 A season to those numbers, just for context. Looking at crab PSC, most of the crab PSC reductions would likely. I'll stop. Yeah.
Mr. Merrill had a question about that. Looks like.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Mr. McCracken. Briefly, on the 391 metric tons, that is, correct me if I'm wrong, my understanding is that is the apportionment that results out of the annual harvest specifications process. And that 391 metric tons would be used to support all fishing in the trawl sector during the A, B, and C seasons. I was wondering if there is a different treatment of the C season. Is it possible to be able to break out the portion of the halibut PSC that is taken during that C season relative to the other two seasons?
Mr. Chairman, Mr. Merrill, yes. I think that we've had some time to think about this. I think there's a couple of approaches you could use to basically separate out a portion of the halibut PSC limit for a C season TLAS. So if the council selects element 2.5 and only allocate A and B season, I think there's the ability and obviously treating the trawl CV C season as a TLAS fishery to assign halibut either to the trawl CV sector in the TLAS fishery is one approach, and then obviously, and then you could also leave it at a combined, I think, at a trawl CV / AFA CP TLAS sector as well. There you could either use either approach, and I believe there might be some disadvantages or advantages to either or. For instance, if you did it by a trawl CV and not leaving it combined with the AFA CP sector, you are creating another box for the agency to manage, and so that would be one disadvantage, I suspect, of go ahead and breaking in the trawl CV halibut PSC usage between the two sectors that share it, but leave the C season as a TLAS fishery, as opposed to keeping it combined with the AFA CP sector and having halibut shared between those two sectors. And then believe that also what you're searching for are some approaches on how you would tease out the portion of halibut that would go to the trawl CV sector, whether you could use historical usage of the sector in the C season from, say, 2004 to 2019 or some group of years, or say using the cod apportionment for the C season at 15% and making a fairly easy separate allocation that 15% of the halibut would be reserved for the C season, and the remaining halibut would then be allocated to the co-ops. Mr. Chairman, Mr. Merrill, I probably went a little too long on that answer. I apologize for that.
Thank you, Mr. McCracken. If I may, Mr. Chairman, just a quick follow-up question. The way that this is phrased for halibut PSC is it's talking about apportionment. And so there are kind of two ways that we allocate halibut. We either establish a limit, which is typically a fixed amount of halibut that does not vary from year to year. Under our current management system, there is a 745 metric ton halibut PSC limit established for the TLAS fishery, the trawl limited access fishery, and then we can apportion that on an annual basis using the harvest specifications process. Because you're using the term apportionment here, I guess, is it correct to interpret this, if you will, allocation of halibut PSC as being something that the council could revisit or change, even though it has been stable at 391 metric tons for quite some time, and vary that through the annual harvest specifications process?
Mr. Chairman, Mr. Merrill, I'm assuming we're referring to the sea season, and if so, then I would say the answer to that question, I believe, is yes. You could leave the sea season TLAS if you were to take the approach of, I think, combining the two sectors and leaving it, leaving that apportionment, that amount that goes to the TLAS cod fishery, to float in the harvest spec process, and then obviously have the amount that goes to the trawl CV cooperative to be a fixed amount. I've indicated, and I think in the analysis a couple of times, is that is a challenge because of the way the harvest or the halibut is apportioned across the TLAS fishery. Sorry, I was getting another phone call. I got distracted there.
Thank you, Mr.
Chairman. Thank you, Mr. Merrill. Yeah.
All right. Mr. Down.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Mr. McCracken. I'm looking at the tables in the document starting on page 184, looking at the crab and tables 2.104, 105, those series of tables there, 103. But I'm just going back to your comment that in the next iteration of this document, we're going to see 2020, and we'll also see a season of 2021. How will these tables be updated? Because these tables are based on the qualifying years that we'll select under options 2.2, 1, 2, and 3. So I'm just wondering how we're going to see those tables. We're not going to be looking at qualifying years of 2020 and 2021, but we're going to need that information in these PSC tables. So I'm just wondering if you could clarify the format that we'll see that in, so we can potentially make a decision on the reductions in the halibut and crab PSC based on recent years.
Mr. Chairman, Mr. Downs, that's a good point, and I think that the way I would probably do it is I'd put a line or something like that after 2019, or some kind of dotted line to indicate that this was the years that were utilized for apportioning the trawl CV and the AFACP's halibut and crab PSC between the two sectors in the TLAS, so that you can see that obviously 2020 and 2021 numbers aren't under consideration for purposes of this motion, unless, of course, the council changes the motion to include 2020 and 2021.
Yeah, thank you for that, John. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
All right. Back to you, Mr. McCracken.
All right, so no further questions on element 3. We'll move to element 4, Gulf sideboards. In December 2020, the council modified the proposed Gulf sideboards to reduce added complexity and reduce management and enforcement burden. Option 4.1, the way it reads is all AFA non-exempt CVs and their LOP licenses will be sideboarded, except for the Central Gulf Rockfish Program, based on the Gulf catch history during the qualifying years from element 2. Table 2-112 on page 199 shows the new calculated sideboard limits for the non-exempt AFA CVs, which are lower than the existing sideboard limits as shown in that table. Several of the limits are likely insufficient to allow directed fishing. Some of these fisheries include like A-season 610 pollock, annual 640 pollock, southeast outside, so forth and so on. So despite an aggregate non-exempt sideboard limit being low and thus sideboard limits, a few vessels do rely on these sideboard fisheries though, just a note, even though the sideboard amount, estimated sideboard amount using the element 2 qualifying years are really low. To ease the management burden, these limits could be closed to directed fishing via a regulation rather than NIMS closing the annually during the harvest spec process. Table 2-113 on page 200 provides the revised Halibut PSC sideboard limits. Staff included a revised AFA Halibut PSC sideboard limits because that was part of the AFA program. In all seasons, the Halibut PSC limits are lower for both deep and shallow water complexes. 3 of the seasonal/complex halibut limits are very low and likely could be insufficient for directed fishing, which would close the arrowtooth fishery, the wreck sole during the first season, and the arrowtooth, wreck sole, and flathead sole, as well as shallow water in the 4th season. Like the groundfish sideboard limits, though, a few vessels, again, do rely on these sideboard fisheries as part of their business plans, and obviously these fisheries are supported by these low sideboard limits. Option 4.2, the AFA Gulf exempt CVs and the non-AFCV sideboard limits. This would prohibit Gulf sideboard exempt AFA CVs and non-AFA CVs from transferring their cod QS assigned to the LOP license as a condition of benefiting from the Gulf sideboard exemption. Got a couple of notes here about some clarifications. One of them is staff recommends removing the reference to the AFA before the Gulf sideboard exemption statement, since both the Gulf sideboard exempt and the non-AFA CVs all benefit from this Gulf sideboard exemption. And in addition, just to be clear that the exemption does not apply to those that are qualified for the Central Gulf Rockfish programs, they also have sideboard limits and they would not be exempt from those sideboard limits. Suboption 4.2.1 would authorize the AFA Gulf exempt CVs and the non-AFA CVs to lease their cod QS while maintaining the benefit of the Gulf exemption if the licenses had less than 200, 400, or 600 metric tons of average QS. Cooperatives would be required to monitor these Gulf exempt CVs to ensure that they do not lease their CQ unless authorized under suboption 4.2.1. We've got some tables in here to provide context on what the AFA Gulf exempt and non-AFA CVs are, their participation in the Bering Sea cod fishery as well as in the Gulf. Table 2-114 and 115 on page 202 provide a vessel count and the average percent of cod QS by qualifying year options for both groups of vessels. What we find is that the Gulf exempt vessels, AFA Gulf exempt vessels, their count ranges between 12 to 15 LOP licenses, and the percent of QS ranges from 12.3 to 15.5%. And for the non-AFACVs, the count of the LOP licenses ranges from 14 to 15, and the percent of QS is 19.2 to 22.4. Table 2-116 and 1 through 119 on page 203 provide a vessel count and retained catch by Gulf fishery for both groups. 118 and 119 unfortunately provided the wrong group of vessels, and I apologize for that, and it will be revised in the next iteration. So that those two tables obviously are out of context. Table 2-120 and 121 on pages 205 and 206 show the number of Gulf exempt and non-AFA CVs with less than 200, 400, and 600 metric tons of average annual allocation under each of the qualifying catch years from element 2. And Mr. Chairman, I'll back up here because I'm assuming I'll have some questions.
Thank you, Mr. McCracken. Mr. Merrill.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Mr. McCracken. John, looking at table 2113 on page 200, that provides what are currently Halibut PSC sideboard limits that apply for AFACVs, and then what the resulting application of that seasonal apportionment of Halibut PSC would be under the various options you've analyzed here. I guess I'm trying to reconcile this table and having a sideboard established for Halibut PSC limits when in the wording of element 4 it talks about sideboards for catch history. Since we don't assign catch history to Halibut PSC, I guess was this sort of an interpretation of how sideboards would be applied in this program to be similar to what was done with the AFA sideboards, or kind of what was the rationale for this particular approach to sideboards?
So, Mr. Chairman, Mr. Merrill, yes, that is when we were originally going through this element, this option in element 4 back prior to the December meeting. The language appeared to be generic enough that it would apply to both the groundfish sideboards as well as the halibut sideboards. So staff interpreted that as recalculating the sideboard limits for both the groundfish and the halibut PSC sideboard limits.
Further questions? Thanks. Mr. McCracken.
Mr. Chairman, if there's moving on to element 5, this is time for me to take a break and have Daryl come on and walk you through elements 5 through, I believe, element 8.
Great. Thanks, Mr. McCracken. Mr. Brandon.
Good morning, Mr. Chairman, members of the council. For the record, my name is Daryl Brannon, and the first issue that we're going to deal with is element 5, which is titled Processor and Community Provisions. During my portion of the presentation, much as I did in December, I'm going to focus primarily on the processor portion of this. Dr. Mike Downs will be tying a bunch of elements together in his presentation that deal with community effects. And so I'm going to focus primarily on the processor portion of the impacts and the discussion of element 5 during my presentation. Element 5 is broken into 4 different elements which basically address 3 different subjects. Element 5.1 states that the program would not create a closed class of processors. And so element 5.2 would establish a directed trawl CV Pacific cod, a limitation on directed trawl CV Pacific cod deliveries to the 2 CPs that are qualified to act as a mothership. Element 5.3 would determine which catcher vessels would be allowed to deliver to catcher processors acting as motherships. And element 2, 5.3 and 5.3 could be selected independently of one another or in conjunction with one another, depending on the wishes of the council. And element 5.4 would allocate harvesting shares to processors based on their processing history during the qualifying period that's selected under alternative 2. Diving in a little bit more detail into each of these elements, the no-close class of processor issue would allow any legally permitted shore-based, floating, or true mothership processor to take directed Pacific cod deliveries from trawl CVs. There's no previous participation requirement. Looking at historical data, from 10 to 12 processors in these categories took Pacific cod deliveries during the qualifying periods that are considered. The 2 CPs that are qualified to act as motherships, as defined under Bering Sea Aleutian Isle Amendment 120, may process directed Pacific cod under the trawl CV apportionment. There's nothing in this action that would allow additional catcher processors to begin acting as motherships, and I think that's clearly stated in the council's intent. There are currently no options to limit true motherships from entering the Pacific cod fishery or increasing the processing history of cod if the cod program provides greater operational flexibility. And these true motherships are traditionally what I think of as the AFA motherships, and they have very limited cod processing in the directed cod fishery in the past, and that may have been incidental to the cod fishery and the pollock fishery and just got placed in the cod fishery. But their history is very small and limited to a very small number of years over the time period considered. And based on their activity in the past and their operational, how they typically operate, we wouldn't expect them to have increased participation in this fishery. Element 5.2 would place a limit on the amount of Pacific cod that may be delivered to catcher processors acting as motherships. And as I said before, when Amendment 120 went in place, we limited the number of motherships that could take deliveries, or catcher processors that could take deliveries of Pacific cod acting as a mothership. There was no limit placed on the amount they could accept. Processing limits would be calculated using the processing history of the 2 CPs and would be confidential and may not be reported either in this analysis or after the limits are implemented if the council selects element 5.2. Benefits from the program will be reduced or eliminated. 2 competing firms take deliveries and compete to process the limit before compete to take deliveries to ensure that they they process a portion of the limit before the limit's reached. Smaller CP processing limits benefit the shoreside processing sector, have greater negative impacts on the CP sector and the CVs that are owned by the CP sector, and the CVs that may have limited markets to deliver onshore or have a limited ability to deliver onshore.
Mr. Twite has a question.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. Mr. Brannon, it's that slide sort of very elegantly points out we're in a funny spot here where we can't understand what the processing limits might be, and therefore there's a lot we can't understand about this. And yet, if we don't provide some additional structure, there's a real potential that these 2 CPs would not receive any of the benefits of this kind of cooperative program. So, pointed out, if we don't do a little steering, we may not meet all the goals of the program relative to these 2 CPs, but we have no idea how we're steering or in what direction. And that's a tough position to be in. So the question I have for you based on that is, do there appear to the analysts to be any non-regulatory factors that may either encourage or discourage the 2 entities from reaching sort of a voluntary or reaching some form of a cooperative solution that would allow them to avoid the race for fish, avoid the competition. Do you have the ability to talk about that at all, or is that also sort of bracketed by the confidentiality limitations?
Mr. Chairman, Mr. Twite, for me, it's really difficult to know what kind of internal discussions those two firms may have in order to divide this limit. They certainly operate differently in terms of whether the vessels they would be taking deliveries from are owned by the firm, or they contract typically with other vessels to make deliveries. There's differences in terms of what the other fisheries they participate in terms of either their directed CP harvests, which may constrain their ability to increase the sideboard or participation in the CDQ fisheries, for example. There are various constraints that could potentially limit how much they could process in the Pacific cod fishery. For me, it's difficult to weigh all the factors, since the two CPs are typically in different cooperative structures currently and don't necessarily work closely together. And so it really becomes difficult for me to understand their ability to work together, their willingness to work together, how constraining the PSC or the processing limit would be in terms of what decisions they may want to make. I think as the limit becomes more constraining on their individual operations, they would probably be less likely to work together and try to harvest as much or process as much as the processing limit as possible. And so there's a lot of factors. I don't know that I gave you a very good answer, Mr. Twite.
Mr. Brandon, you gave as good an answer as you could, and which then I'm going to repay by asking another question that may be equally difficult to answer. And that is then, so you pointed out in your answer that one of the big differences between the two is that one CP is part of a company that also has catcher vessels, and the other CP is part of a company that may not have any, and it primarily has relied on independent catcher vessels to deliver product. As you point out, sort of the uncertainties or some of the difficulties in trying to make that assessment, do those difficulties in making that assessment also apply to understanding the potential impacts to the catcher vessels in those two different scenarios?
Mr. Chairman, Mr. Twite, I think it especially would apply to the catcher vessels that are more independent catcher vessels. I think depending on if the firm owns their own catcher vessels, and I would like to point out that the analysis does show that when we get into later in this discussion, that both firms do own licenses that would be assigned quota share under this program. And so they may both control some of their own, the fish that they would be processing and determining which catcher vessels harvest. But if a firm has the ability to kind of estimate how much of the limit that they will be able to process with their own vessels, they may be able to think ahead and do some contracting, arrange some arrangements to have their catcher vessels deliver part of their quota onshore. For independent contractors, during the season, that may be more difficult if they've got a contract with an offshore processor and they realize the fishery is going faster than they thought it may. To me, it seems like there may be an additional complication. I'm not saying it would be easy for either of the firms to figure out, but there may be an additional complication for the firm that deals more with independent catcher vessels in terms of the independent catcher vessels' certainty on what their market may ultimately be that year.
Thank you very much.
Ms. Kimball.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Since they're answering questions now, I thought I would just jump in. Are there, Mr. Brannon, any options proposed for the sideboards under 5.2 or limitations on the 2 CPs that are eligible to continue processing as motherships in this fishery that provide something lower than their processing history?
Mr. Chairman, Ms. Kimball, the options that are being considered do not have an option that would give them less than their processing history under any of the options. There is a potential that when we get to element 5.2.1 that the firms could select the better of their history between the LP license, the quota share associated with the LP licenses they hold, and their processing history. But both firms under this option would get could share their processing history. So the fact that they would share the processing history may result in both firms, or one of the 2 firms, actually processing less than their history. But in aggregate, they would both have a minimum of their processing history.
Thank you.
Ms. Baker.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. That exchange got to a lot of my question. And so, Mr. Brannon, my next question was actually on table 2-125 in the analysis, but it sounds like maybe you have another slide related to this element that maybe I'll hold the question until we get through that, and I might not have a question anymore. Thanks, Mr. Chair.
All right. Thanks, Ms. Baker. Mr. Brannon.
Mr. Chairman, I think we've covered several of the issues that are bullet points on this slide already, and that if the CP firms can't agree on how to divide the processing limit, it could result in the race to process the limit. We don't know whether the 2 firms will be able to come to any sort of agreement. The firms that own their own CVs would want to be able to take deliveries from their own CVs at approximately the same level of cooperative quota assigned to those licenses. The firm that contracts with CVs for delivery and owns LLP licenses would want to maintain those relationships as much as possible and continue to take deliveries from CVs that delivered them from the past. Independent catcher vessel owners not designed efficiently to deliver shoreside could be placed in a relatively weak bargaining position when trying to obtain a market, or they may need to lease their cooperative quota. And so I don't know that we'd be moving on to 5.2.1, and I don't know that I directly addressed Ms. Baker's question, so I'd be happy to circle back. And just note that one of the firms is better off when calculating the sideboard limit under 5.2.1 based on their processing history. The other is better off based on the quota share that would be assigned to the licenses they own. And since this option would allow the 2 firms to select the best option for them, it would increase the overall processing limit relative to element 5.2, which is based on processing history.
Ms. Baker.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thanks, Mr. Brannon. And so I understand the concept that you just described, and I'm trying to reconcile that with what's actually in table -125. So I really do hate to ask this, but can you just walk through each of the rows on those tables in terms of the ratios that you provided for the percent change of the processing limit on the qualifying years? I'm just having trouble discerning between those.
Yeah, and it is fairly complicated, and so the ratios are just calculated for each of the 4 or 3 time periods that the council is considering under element 2. The LLP history divided by the processing history is 120%. So if you base both firms' history on the processing history, if you took processing history as the denominator and you used LLP history as the numerator, that ratio is 120% for 2004 through 2019. If you allowed, so you can see that basing it on LLP history gives a larger processing limit than processing history alone. The next row shows that if you gave the firms the ability under 5.2.1 to select either their processing history or the LLP history, you can see that it would still increase the processing limit relative to if the denominator was simply the LLP history. And because LLP history was greater than processing history, as we saw in the first row, if you select the third row, you can see that selecting the best divided by processing history gives you yet a larger percent relative to processing history of what the sideboard, I keep wanting to call it a sideboard limit, a processing limit would be.
Okay, thank you. And so that's really helpful, and I think you and Ms. Kimball already addressed sort of my other question related to that, and so it's just hard to understand how, for example, looking at select best divided by processing history 2004 to 2019 results in 152% of that would be the processing limit. It's hard to understand how that would be constraining under any scenario, but what I clearly heard you say was the aspect of element 5.2 is that the 2 CPs would be sharing that limit rather than each having their own. That's the critical factor there. Is that correct?
Mr. Chairman, Ms. Baker, it's one of the factors. And under 5.2, it would be based, the limit would be based on their processing history, which is kind of the lowest. If they both use their processing history, that kind of results in the lowest limit that would be applied to them. If it were based on either of the other, if they were allowed to select their best on an individual firm basis, their best, either their processing history or based on the licenses they hold, the sideboard limit would be increased. And so under 5.2, the sideboard limit's fairly low. They get relative to the other options. And fairly low relative to the other options is important because I can't tell you whether it's high or low or what it is. But they share the sideboard limit. Under 5.2.1, they would get their own sideboard limit and be given the opportunity to select which limit is best for them, the way that it's currently structured. And in aggregate, that would increase the total amount of processing limit that would be available to the 2 CPs.
Thank you for that clarification. That's helpful. Thank you.
Thanks, Ms. Baker. Mr. Brandon.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I think I've covered all the information on this slide already in questions. Element 5.3 takes a different approach to limiting the amount of cod that could be processed by catcher processors acting as motherships. Option 1 would only allow catcher vessels that are assigned to an LOP license that is 75% owned by a firm that owns an eligible CP as of December 31st, 2019 to deliver to the CP sector. In other words, under 5.2 that we just talked about, we're setting, the council could potentially set a limit on the amount of cod that's delivered to CPs. Under element 5.3, we're taking a different tact and limiting the number of catcher vessels that may deliver to the CPs. And without any limit being imposed under 5.2, there would be no actual limit to the amount that the CPs could process, as long as they stayed within the limit of the amount of quota held by the CVs using licenses, or as long as they stayed within the limit of the CVs using licenses that they have. In other words, they didn't acquire more quota history. As many as 10 LP licenses were owned by the 3 firms that were legally qualified to act as a mothership on December 31st, 2019. And that date, I just want to point out that date falls after the Federal Register notice was published, but before the rule took effect. And so that's why there are 3 catcher processor firms that were legally allowed to take landings on that date, as opposed to the 2 that we talked about that are currently qualified, because that rule had not gone into effect yet. The result of date difference is that 1 additional catcher vessel could potentially qualify to deliver offshore. And I would also note that when I developed Table 2-126, I was thinking about using it for a variety of different things, and the LLP license number 24 in that table has an asterisk that should not be included as the 75% owned by the 3 CP firms, so that should be removed. The total amount of targeted federal Pacific cod catch associated with the license is greater than the amount of processing history associated with 2 CPs, and that's the discussion that we've been having. And the council, if they want to provide any additional opportunities for catcher vessels not 75% owned by the 2 CP firm or the 3 CP firms that are qualified as of that date, those 10 vessels, then you would need to provide additional direction under option 2 of element 5.3. Before I move on from this section, I would like to just take a brief moment to talk about Table 2-126, and it's on page 213 of the analysis. And the development of this table was my attempt to show all the catcher vessel LLP licenses that have been used on catcher vessels when they delivered to CPs acting as motherships. And the percentages in that table show the percent that was delivered to CPs acting as motherships. And so if the percent is 0 in a year, that means all the deliveries associated with that LLP license that year were made to a processing entity other than one of the catcher processors acting as a mothership. And so you can kind of look through that table and see the LLP licenses that have an asterisk by them with whether they delivered all of their catch to CPs, whether they delivered a smaller percentage of the catch to CPs, to give you an idea of the relative amount of history associated with that license under the various qualifying years that may be considered that could be potentially delivered to CPs under element 5.3. And because we can't get into quantities, I simply show you the percent on an annual basis and over the 3 years considered, as well as the number of years that were delivered to CPs during that qualifying period. And basically, due to the restrictions placed on confidentiality, that's about the most information that I could provide in a way that I could figure out how to provide it.
Mr. Merrill.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Mr. Brandon. Quick question for you, although it may delve into policy issues a bit. When I look at element 5.2 and then I look at element 5.3, they seem to be trying to accomplish a very similar policy objective. So I'm wondering if when the council is trying to address this issue of potential movement of Pacific cod offshore, if this is sort of an either or choice between 5.2 and 5.3, or what challenges or complications we have if we try and combine both of these two elements at the same time. Thanks.
Mr. Chairman, Mr. Merrill, as I said in the beginning, there is nothing that would prohibit the council from selecting both. I think in reality the intent was when element 5.3 was added at the December meeting, it was added as kind of an alternative option to element 5.2. So instead of placing a hard limit on the number or the amount of quota that could be delivered to CPs, a firm may prefer that they have the option of just taking the deliveries from their own catcher vessel fleet and not necessarily expand beyond that, but be able to take deliveries from the vessels they own. And so I think that's basically the way the elements evolved over time. And as I said, I think the council has the option to select both, but I don't think that was necessarily the intent when these two different elements were put in place. And again, it certainly is a policy decision on how the council would wish to proceed with that.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Mr. Brandon.
Element 5.4 addresses harvest quota shares to processors. This option would allocate a percentage of the available harvest quota to processors that took directed Bering Sea, Aleutian Islands specific cod deliveries during the qualifying years. The range considered is 0% if the council doesn't select element 5.4, up to 30% of the total available CQ that's allocated or quota shared. It's really CQ unless you force the quota share units to match in terms of value, because the processor is based on their processing and the harvesters are based on their deliveries, and so essentially there's separate quota share pools for the two, and the CQ that results, unless you force the units of cooperative, the quota share units to be equal, it's the up to 30% of the annual CQ that would be available to harvest is the percentage range that we're talking about here. This option only applies to Bering Sea processors. If Aleutian Islands processors are granted an allocation under element 6.2, when we get to that element, allocations will be based on the same criteria established under element 2 for harvesters in terms of the years that will be included. Processor-owned quota or catcher vessels may only harvest or control an amount of CQ equal to amount they would have brought into the cooperative, absent the processor allocation. And this element was developed at the last time the council looked at this issue, and it was driven by concern that if processors are given an amount of harvest quota, that there may be some concern that processors could potentially stack all that quota on harvest vessels they own when they're vertically integrated firms. And basically utilize their own vessels to harvest that quota. Certainly, based on all the discussions that we've had with representatives from the processing sector, that hasn't been the intent of how they described their plans to utilize this quota. But this was an explicit decision made by the council in part to clearly define how the quota could be used in the future. I think it's important to point out that the analysis does not estimate an optimal allocation of harvest shares to processors because data are not available to make those estimates, and an optimal division will likely vary annually. There's a literature review provided in the analysis. I would say that I will probably expand that literature review a little bit for next time the council sees this analysis. I don't think it's going to change the conclusions that we draw in the section or the alternatives provided. I also think that we may be able to provide a little bit more detailed discussion of the impacts of either very small or very large allocations of harvest shares to processors, and those are likely on the large side, likely go beyond the maximum percentage that the council is considering. But the impacts of say, if the allocation to processors were too large, then it would provide little flexibility for a catcher vessel to be able to leave a processing firm, given and make up any of the difference in quota share they'd be walking away from to by getting a better price or whatever additional benefits they could receive by leaving a processor. That being said, I think the intent, as stated by processors and other individuals for the use of these quota shares, is to stabilize the two sectors, try and keep historical linkages between the harvesters and processors. Processors and harvesters have agreements currently. They have associations with one another. They work well with one another, and they just want to be able to maintain those arrangements into the future without a large disruption. And that is one of the reasons that the allocation of quota share to processors is being considered under this package.
Mr. Cross.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Good morning, Mr. Brannon. A quick question, and again, I'll apologize if I missed it somewhere. How do floaters fit into this? So if you have it's not a mothership, but a floater that goes way up north, and is there limits on how much that floater can take? Does it have to be associated with a co-op? Explain to me where you see floaters fitting into this processor picture.
Mr. Chairman, Mr. Cross, good morning to you too. And the way the floaters fit into this picture is there's no limitation on the amount of cod that floaters could process. The only limitation being put on a processing sector is the two catcher processors under Amendment 120. There would be nothing that would prohibit a floater from either forming its own cooperative with a group of catcher vessels and fishing somewhere else, or if the floater is owned by a processing firm that has a separate cooperative, that they would be able to have some sort of agreements within the cooperative structure for catcher vessels within their cooperative to deliver to that floater. I think part of your question also revolved around moving further north, and I think that again goes back to whether if the fish were to move further north, or if there was some other motivation for processing to increase more in a more northerly area. If there were a certain number of license holders that wanted to form a cooperative and fish in that area and deliver to a processor that is in a more northerly area, there's nothing in the program that would prevent them from doing that.
Mr. Chairman, one follow-up if possible.
Mr. Cross.
Thank you, Mr. Brown. That explains, that helps a lot. And just to clarify, so if anybody could put together a floater, and if they could convince boats to form a co-op around them, they could put that floater to use in this fishery in the Aleutians or way up north, or even outside of Dutch Harbor somewhere down south. So there is no historical part that prevents anybody from putting a floater and a group of vessels together, forming a co-op to harvest without limits in this fishery. Is that correct?
Mr. Chairman, Mr. Cross, that's correct. I would say to process without limit instead of to harvest without limit, given the quota share restrictions that are applied to the vessels within their fleet. But that is my understanding. You know, there's a lot of moving parts in this package as well, and so one of those moving parts would be they would have to, assuming it was a new processing company and bringing in a new floater, they may not have these processing shares to, quote, make a vessel whole to what they would have received before. So there may be some additional obstacles that the processor would have to overcome to make that business plan work. But there certainly is nothing that would prevent it from occurring in regulations that the council is currently considering developing.
Thank you very much.
Thanks, Mr. Cross. Ms. Baker.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. Mr. Brennan, I have a question about your statement on the slide that the data are not available to make estimates of the optimal allocation of harvest shares to processors. And I just wonder, that's been a point of discussion a little bit with the SSC and at this meeting. Can you just give a high-level overview of what data would have to be available to make those estimates? Because there seems to be a little bit of a disagreement about sort of how far the analysis can go in that regard.
Mr. Chairman, thank you, Ms. Baker. In my opinion, you would need quite a bit of data, especially on the costs, both the harvesting sector and the processing sector, to be able to make estimates as was proposed in the literature by Dr. Matulich. You know, as I said, because what he indicates is that you would need to be able to calculate quasi-rents, which is basically looking at variable costs relative to revenue. And so you would need sufficient information on all the variable costs of the processors and the harvesters to be able to kind of equalize those numbers. Another methodology that's kind of hinted at, I think, in the SSC minutes is, well, if the real concern is sunk capital, you know, because these firms have invested a lot of money in plants and lines that are specific to cod processing, then you could consider figuring out the amount that was spent on cod plants and cod equipment that would be no longer useful to the firm, and basically issue an amount of quota share where the quota share value would equal that expenditure. Personally, I don't think that would be a very useful way to look at it, because there's a lot of other factors involved in, you know, keeping your deliveries together as opposed to just being allocated enough quota share to cover sunk costs. And so I guess it's kind of a long-winded answer, and I apologize for that, is you'd need some fairly detailed information on, at a minimum, the variable costs of all the processors and harvesters involved in this to understand what their variable costs are in both sectors, which is typically well beyond what we collect in the current EDR structures, and it becomes difficult to ferret out, especially when you're trying to divide those costs between various fisheries that the firms participate in. On the harvest side, for example, if you're a poly boat and you fish in the Gulf some, how much of these variable costs do you actually attribute to the cod fishery? Anyway, that's a long-winded answer, I guess.
That's helpful, and I think, I that is really helpful, and I will hold my questions there. Thanks very much, Mr. Brennan.
Ms. Campbell.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Daryl, if you could go back to slide 36, I saw the statement on the slide and in the analysis, and I just had a simple question. But when you say this option only applies to Bering Sea processors, what is a Bering Sea processor?
Madam, or Mr. Chairman, Ms. Campbell, it's not an Aleutian Islands shore-based processor, I guess is what I would define it as. And when we get into element 6.1, there's Aleutian. We would define Aleutian Island shore-based processors, and so this is everybody except the Aleutian Island shore-based processors.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, Mr. Brennan. That's how I interpreted it too. I wanted to make sure that there wasn't some alternate interpretation that it was a processor located in the regulatory area that took certain types of deliveries. It's essentially anybody but those who might be affected by element 6.
Mr. Chairman, Ms. Campbell, that's the way that I interpreted it, and if that wasn't the intent, then I would need direction from the council to interpret it differently.
Great. Thanks, Ms. Campbell. We'll take a question from Ms. Kimball, and then we'll take our morning break.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, Mr. Brannon. I'm just going back a little bit to Ms. Baker's question and the discussion with the SSC in terms of data availability. And the one that you mentioned at the end was one approach in terms of looking at how you compensate for excess capacity in the fishery that occurs after you rationalize. And we had an exchange with the SSC, and I don't know if you were able to hear that, but my intent was that in the SSC discussion was that if the council's not put forward that that's the reason for contemplating element 5.4, and the objectives of that element are more aligned with what you have in the analysis, I'm talking about pages 216, then is there a real advantage, I guess, to going down that road and trying to provide that level of information? Does that add anything to our decision? And my question to you is, does the council need to do a better job, I guess, in explaining or characterizing the objectives behind element 5.4 or any of the elements in order to have our analysis more aligned with the questions and the objectives that we've put forward?
Mr. Chairman, Ms. Kimball, whether the council needs to do a better job or I need to do a better job, I is probably falls on the analyst more than the council, simply because I think in your problem statement you lay out several objectives of the program, and I think it never hurts to have the council be more specific in the things they want to see either analyzed or the objectives they want to see obtained from a program. But I think I could do a better job of expanding the discussion and highlighting, especially once we have a PPA or close to a PPA or whenever that may occur, just discussing how the council's preferred alternative aligns with the elements and options, or not elements and options, but the problem statement and the goals and objectives of the program.
I appreciate that. And a quick follow-up, Mr. Chair, before the break, is that I thought I heard you say, and this is also in relation to some of the SSC requests, that there is an opportunity to kind of expand the literature review on this section to provide any more information that might help with the SSC's review of this document. Did I hear that correctly?
Mr. Chairman, Ms. Kimball, that's my intent, to do a little bit of expansion on the literature review and provide more information. So yes, I intend to do that, whether I receive direction from the council to do that or not.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Ms. Kimball. Okay, let's take a 10-minute break and come back 10:15 Alaska time. back to order. Okay, I think we're ready to continue on with the presentation. Mr. Cross, you didn't have another question, did you? Okay. All right, Mr. Brandon, whenever you're ready.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I think we've already covered this slide and this slide. Just a little bit of background information on the element 5.4. And this is some information you've already seen in December, so I'm not going to go over it in detail. But just looking at the top 4 processing firms, and this is at the firm level again and not the plant level, that the top 4 firms, depending on what seasons you select and what years you select, would be allocated about 75% of the processing shares. If you expand that to the top 8 firms, they cover about 95% of the processing shares that would be issued under element 5.4. And one outstanding issue, and it's primarily an issue that deals with processors that have been participating in the Aleutian Islands that are no longer active processors. The council, if they want staff to consider allocations to entities and what happens to the processing history associated with those plants, will need some additional direction. Just a reminder, we don't have any criteria for determining the successor in interest, and there was never one that was developed on the West Coast. When I presented to you last December, I indicated that it was the council's direction that the National Marine Fisheries Service would develop that criteria. After the meeting, I did some more research and found out that it was never actually ever developed, probably because it didn't raise to be a significant issue during the implementation of the program. But the Pacific Council did state in their discussion on this issue that the transfer of physical assets alone should not be considered a basis for successor in interest. Business relationships such as transfer of the company name and customer database might be reasonable evidence of a successor in interest. The value of the processing history in determining the sale price was also considered as an element that the Pacific Council directed NIMS they may want to consider. And just as a reminder that when we're talking about issuing quota share to processors, they don't have a durable permit because they have federal processing permits and a sundry of other licenses that they must have in order to act as a processor. But they don't have anything similar to what the LOP license that harvesters hold. So the intent of the council is to have the National Marine Fisheries Service issued a new processor permit that the quota share would be attached to, and that processor permit would be transferable, much like a LP license would be and could be sold. Processors that do not receive an initial allocation.
Before we move on, Ms. Baker has a question.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. A little late there. Still on the successor and interest issue, I am wondering also, I don't remember seeing in the analysis, of course, in the North Pacific Council, the Bering Sea and Aleutian Islands Crab Rationalization Program is really the one rationalization program that might be comparable in this regard. Did the North Pacific Council recognize any kind of successor and interest provision for that program, Daryl? I can't remember.
Mr. Chairman, Ms. Baker, off the top of my head, I can't give you a good answer. It's something that I can certainly look into and provide additional information, after public comment or sometime in the future, where people can speak to during public comment. But I'm afraid if I tried to answer it now, I'd just flat be wrong.
All right. Thank you for that. That sounds like a good plan. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thanks, Ms. Baker. Mr. Brandon.
Processors that do not receive an initial allocation or receive a small allocation of harvest shares may need to offer higher ex-vessel prices, better delivery terms, or other market incentives to make up for not being able to provide additional quota to attract harvesters. And this gets back to what's the intent of how the quota is going to be used. And as I've mentioned before, processors have indicated that their intent is to basically make harvesters whole in terms of what their initial allocation would have been, and to try and stabilize the markets. You know, there certainly is nothing in the program that would prevent harvesters from moving between markets or making other business decisions under this program, but the intent of the processor allocation, at least one of the intents, is to help stabilize the fishery. Firms that receive a small allocation or no allocation may be at a competitive disadvantage, which may make it more difficult or at least increase costs for new processors to enter the fishery. We do note in the analysis, however, that in the West Coast whiting fishery, the IFQ fishery, where processors were issued harvest shares, that there have been new processors successfully enter that fishery and expand the amount that they process. So while there could be barriers imposed on new entry, they were not. They were overcome by some firms in the West Coast.
Ms. Campbell has a question.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Daryl, I'm not especially familiar with the West Coast fisheries. Do you have more information about how new processors were able to access the whiting fishery, and you know, what portion of the fishery actually is processed by new entrants, and what tools they use to do that? Is that available to us somewhere?
Mr. Chairman, Ms. Campbell, I did not include that in the analysis, and I certainly can work to get some of that information included in the next version. But my understanding is that they were basically able to attract vessels by offering a higher price than other processors, and were able to attract vessels to deliver to them that way. And they have been able to enter the fishery and expand their footprint in the fishery at some level. But I can't give you specific numbers at this point. It's certainly something that we can work to have included in the analysis in the next version, and I'm certain that there are people that will be testifying that are very familiar with that fishery and can provide additional information as well.
Okay, thank you, Daryl.
If there are no additional questions, Mr. Chairman, I will move on to element 6. And this is the Aleutian Islands processor provisions. Element 6.1 would establish a cooperative set-aside, and element 6.2 would establish an allocation of harvest shares to processors in the Aleutian Islands. The two elements, the Council identified that they're mutually exclusive, and element 6.2 may not be selected with element 6.4, with 5.4, which is the processor allocations that we just talked about. The Council did not specifically state whether it was their intent that element 5.4 and element 5 or 6.1 are mutually exclusive, and so that's something that you may wish to clarify. Element 6.1 would establish a set-aside of 10 to 25% of the A-season trawl CV sector-directed BSAI harvest that cooperatives would be allocated for delivery only to AI shore plants. Element 6.2 would establish an annual allocation of CQ to AI plant operators or an entity representing the community equal to the lesser of 5.5% to 10% of the total BSAI trawl CV Pacific cod quota, or 5,000 metric tons, whichever is less, during years the community notifies NIMS the plant will be operating. the council will need to request that NIMS re-implement certain regulations that were removed by vacating Amendment 113. This is just a list of some of those regulations, and we talked about them at the last meeting, and so I'm not going to spend any significant amount of time on it. One of the recommendations that I made in the paper is that under the third bullet, the inset bullet, a limit on the amount of the A season from January 20th to April 1st, Pacific cod that may be harvested from the AI by vessels that are not delivering CV trawl Pacific cod to the AI shore plant may need to be enacted to ensure that the AI TAC is not taken before the cooperatives can finish delivering to the AI shore plants. And in the analysis, we talk about this could be implemented to ensure that there would always be fish available during the A season to cover the amount of either the set aside or the allocation under 6.1 or 6.2. That wasn't a part of the program under Amendment 113. There was a restriction on harvest in the Bering Sea to ensure that the catcher vessels didn't harvest their entire allocation in the Bering Sea before they moved to the Aleutian Islands. This is a little different take on that same type of provision.
Ms. Baker.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So following up on that point, Daryl, that third bullet, and I did get a little confused, honestly, reading the analysis related to this point. Was the recommendation for the council to clarify that this limit would be established under both element 6.1 and 6.2?
Mr. Chairman, Mr. Canine, or Ms. Baker, I apologize. I think if you wanted to ensure that the AI shore plant had the ability to prosecute the fishery how they intend during the year and use the flexibility granted by a LAP program, if you did not create a set-aside under either 6.1 or 6.2, in other words, it may potentially be needed for both, there is nothing that would prevent other sectors from coming in and harvesting the Pacific cod Aleutian Islands TAC during the A season before the trawl CV sector harvests either their set-aside or the cooperative allocation given to the plant or the community representative of the plant. And certainly under 6.2, the plant would have more control over when those deliveries occurred, and it may not be as necessary under 6.2, whereas under 6.1, it's up to the individual cooperatives that receive the allocation to work with a plant and determine how and when to deliver the set-aside. And so the Aleutian Islands shore plant or community have less control of the quota under 6.1, and it may be more beneficial there. But under 6.2, depending on what other sectors decide to do in terms of their fishing patterns that year, they could also preempt the Aleutian Islands catcher vessel deliveries to shore plants.
Thank you for that, and that's helpful because I think, well, you're not all the way through element 6 yet, but one of the things I'm struggling with a little bit in terms of the different approaches under element 6.1 and 6.2, the 6.1 being essentially the Amendment 113 set aside that the council has recommended and NIMS implemented previously and was subsequently withdrawn. And then the element 6.2, which is more of the cooperative style approach that we're taking with the rest of the program. And so I'm struggling with the third bullet here, which if actually through regulations and NIMS management, we implement some of the things, this A-season limitation that wasn't yet implemented for Amendment 113, but actually the council had recommended that seems like a regulated solution to achieve an objective versus, our stated preference, at least thus far in this action, to have cooperative management and some of the flexibility and more efficient operations that cooperative management can bring us. And so I appreciate that answer. I guess I don't really have a question other than, so my takeaway from your response was that at a minimum, element 6.1, which is the Amendment 113 set-aside approach, it seems especially important for the council to consider establishing this limit on the amount of A-season Pacific cod that could be harvested by vessels in the Aleutians. Is that fair to say?
Mr. Chairman, Ms. Baker, I think that's fair to say. And without trying to belabor the point, and again, I think the need for the set-aside really depends on the amount of security you want to give the Aleutian Islands shore plant and the community that there will be fish available to deliver to them. And I think the slight difference between the flexibility of the overall program and how it interacts with this specific element is there's a requirement. We have separate tax for the Bering Sea and the Aleutian Islands. We're requiring that a certain percentage of the catch be taken out of the Aleutian Islands and delivered to the Bering Sea. And so if we weren't focusing on the Aleutian Island shore plant, if the Aleutian Islands closed, then other cooperatives would have the ability to move to the Bering Sea, where there technically still should be fish available for them to harvest during the A season. But because the program requires that for the Aleutian Island shore plant, it be harvested from the Aleutians and delivered to the Aleutian Island shore plant, if the Aleutian Islands closes, they don't have that flexibility to move to the Bering Sea to finish their fishing year. I know it's a slight twist in the overall flexibility, what can we do argument, but I think it's a possibility, and it gets even more complicated by the timing of the two fisheries, where the Bering Sea usually is fished first, and then people move to the Aleutian Islands based on fishing conditions and a variety of other factors. And so people may wish to argue, and it's probably a valid argument, that people would likely fish in the Bering Sea first, and it wouldn't be as it may not be always necessary to have a set aside in the Aleutians. I just wanted to raise the issue for people for a wide variety of people to think through the issue and see if they feel it's necessary as well.
Thank you, Daryl. That's very helpful. I appreciate it. Thanks, Mr. Chair.
Thanks, Ms. Baker. Ms. Kimball.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, Mr. Brannon. Just a quick question. This slide, you're not asking the council to calculate and define a DFA versus an ICA every year, but making us aware that this is likely a necessary element under 6.1, such that we're aware that regulations that NIMS would determine would create a DFA and ICA, and then that calculation would be made annually. Is that what I'm understanding?
Mr. Chairman, Ms. Kimball, that is correct. Just a little bit of information that's presented in the document, Mr. Chairman, under element 6.1, which is the set aside that the individual co-ops would have to figure out how to deliver an amount of the AI shore plants. Table 2-30 shows the set aside amount that would have resulted considering A season tax from 2003 through 2020. There's currently no requirement that a specific amount of PSE is reserved for use in the Aleutian Islands fishery. And under that issue, the overall assumption in this program is that quota cod PSE follows in the same proportion as the cod quota that's assigned to a cooperative. And recall under 6.1, there is no Aleutian Islands cooperative necessarily. And so the PSE would be distributed to the individual cooperatives, and there's no direction in the package currently that says that a cooperative has to reserve a certain amount to ensure that there's halibut or whatever other PSE species may be appropriate for the Aleutians available to ensure that the cod can be delivered. The data shows that the 10% set aside would give you a range of about 2,000 to 3,800 metric tons with an average of about 301,000 tons. The 25% set aside would be closer to 5,000 to about 9,500 metric tons with an average of about 7,700 metric tons over the period. Element 6.2 is the allocation of quota of cooperative quota to either the plant or an entity representing the community. And 6.2 would allocate the lesser of 5,000 metric tons or 5.5 to 10% of the annual quota. 6.1 was simply based on the A-season apportionment of the Bering Sea cod BSAI cod tax. 6.2 is based on the annual allocation. NIMS would hold the underlying quota share units and only allocate annual CQ based on whether the community represented submitted a timely application indicating the plant would be operational and processing Pacific cod that year. The plant / community would then assign CQ to cooperative vessels to harvest the Aleutian Island cod and deliver the fish to the AI shore plant. The council added a provision at the last meeting that this issue was taken up that indicated that ADAC or ADCA may withdraw its intent to operate during the season, and any unused quota would then be reissued to the other AI shore plant in years that two communities filed the intent to operate, or to the other PCTC cooperatives in years that only one plant was active. There is no other reallocation timeline established if the plan is unable to use all of the CQ that was allocated as there was under Amendment 113. And so it's also important to remember that there is no requirement that all the quota be harvested from the Aleutian Islands or delivered to an AI shore plant under Element 6.2. The council's motion provides the opportunity for the shore plant or the community to lease that quota during the year, and so there's probably fewer incentives for the community or the shore plant to release that quota back and have it reallocated to the other cooperatives free of charge when they could potentially lease the quota and receive a revenue stream, even if the plant was unable to operate or finish operating in that year. If no AI community files an intent to operate for an upcoming fishing year, the CQ derived from NIMS and quota share would be issued to other quota shareholders in the same proportion as their initial allocation and then redistributed to the cooperatives. Table 2-131 shows the AI allocations that would result, again, using the 2003 through 2020 timeline. Because PSE under 6.2 would be apportioned in the same percentage of CQ allocated to the AI plant would actually receive a pro rata share of the PSE, and the bottom two bullets simply showed the numbers that were calculated based on the 5 and 10% tax that were established from 2003 through 2020.
Mr. Merrill.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Mr. Brannon. If you could go back one slide. just in terms of the processes that are described here, I was wondering if you'd had a chance to work with our staff to kind of clarify some of those logistical challenges that can come up when we are trying to allocate or reallocate quota in the middle of a season, particularly if there are particular time constraints in order to allow for the effective harvest of that quota?
Mr. Chairman, Mr. Merrill, I don't know that we've specifically worked with your staff to address that question. It's certainly something that would be appropriate to make sure that we cover thoroughly in the next version of the analysis. And it's something that I will write on my to-do list as something that we need to do.
Thank you.
Element 6.2.3 is an AI small vessel provision that was included in the document when the council looked at this issue last. And the provision would require that the AI shore plants create a set-aside of their allocation of quota share that ranges from 10 to 50% that could only be harvested by trawl CVs that are less than 60 feet length overall. Currently, the only vessels that have a less than 60-foot license, trawl license, that could fish in the Aleutians are the 8 LLP licenses associated with the 8 transferable AI endorsements. However, just to remind the council that when the LLP program was developed, there was a downgrade provision in the LLP program that would allow any LLP license with a AI trawl endorsement to be fished on a vessel less than 60 feet length overall. So technically, any of the LLP licenses could be utilized by a less than 60-foot vessel if they had access to that license in some way and participate in this fishery. But currently, it would only apply to the vessels that have those 8 transferable AI endorsements. We did take a quick look at the catching power of the vessels that are currently associated with those 8 transferable AI endorsements relative to the allocation that a AI shore plant may receive. And it does appear based on their past CPUE that they would have the harvesting capacity to catch the entire 50% set aside if the council decided to move forward with an option to provide them that opportunity. Providing the less than 60-foot vessels with exclusive access to the AI processor allocation increases the small vessels market power and decreases the AI plant's market power when negotiating delivery terms and conditions. In other words, because the processor has to negotiate with those vessels to ensure the cod are delivered to their plant, it puts the vessels in a relatively stronger position bargaining and the processor in a relatively weaker position.
Ms. Baker.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thanks for that. And it occurred to me as I was reading the analysis for this element 6.2.3 that we don't have something like this in element 6.1. And so I just can't remember. My question then is, did we have a small vessel provision in Amendment 113 in terms of the harvest set aside, and some portion of that had to be harvested by smaller vessels, or was that not a part of Amendment 113?
Mr. Chairman, Ms. Baker, to my knowledge, it was not a part of Amendment 113. There was no requirement that small vessels delivered, and I'd be happy to have John or someone else correct me if I'm wrong. And I think the difference between if you wanted to consider a small vessel provision under element 6.1 versus 6.2 is under 6.2, the small vessels would be negotiating with the AI Shore Plant Cooperative. Under element 6.1, the small vessels would have to work with perhaps an intercooperative agreement group of all of the cooperatives in the Bering Sea to figure out how that they're going to be given access to quota to be able to harvest it and deliver it to the AI Shore Plant.
Thank you, Mr. Brannon. Thanks, Mr. Chair.
Mr. Chairman, if there are no further questions on element 6, I'll move on to element 7. And this deals with the transfers of quota share assigned to LLP licenses. Quota share is based on catch history assigned and is assigned to LLP groundfish licenses. Once assigned to the license, the quota share may not be severed from the LP license unless the council selects the 90-day option for AFA non-exempt vessels to transfer quota share between LLP licenses. For LLP licenses with a severable, several was the wrong word there, severable AI trawl endorsements, the quota share would not be severable from the endorsement, but the endorsement itself is transferable between LLP licenses, and we've had some internal discussion in staff whether that could effectively translate into leasing of quota share by being able to move that endorsement around between LLP licenses. It was just an observation that we pointed out, given that the intent of the program is to have quota that's non-severable from the license. Selling the LLP license transfers the quota share along with the LLP license. Any person eligible to purchase an LLP license may purchase an LLP license and the quota share initially assigned to the license. The groundfish license limits a person from holding more than 10 groundfish licenses at any one time. And the ownership caps established under element 8 could further limit the number of LLP licenses that a person may hold. The option to allow quota share assigned to LLP licenses with a non-exempt AFA CVs during the 90-day window, starting at the time with the clock starting at the time of the publishing of the final rule, raises some questions. Those questions are listed below, and they were helped provided to us by NIMP staff primarily. And they just wanted to raise the issue that final rules are not typically effective until 90 days after or 30 days after publication. And so it assumes an individual quota share unit may only be transferred one time. The transfers could be divided between more than one LLP license, and NIMS will need to further develop a description of the transfer application and timing for the next iteration of the analysis. Given all these factors, whether the 90-day period is sufficient, given the timing between the publishing of the final rule and the program becomes effective, and giving people time to settle all these cases, is something I think that the National Marine Fisheries Service remains somewhat concerned with. And we're looking for additional clarification on the assumptions that we made in that section.
Mr. Twite.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. Mr. Brannon, if the council considers this option for the 90-day window, should the and if council thinks about how those, whether there's any restrictions on those transfers, should the council, is it important for the council to think about consistency between the guidelines for how these transfers could be accomplished with whatever the council's decision is regarding how stacked licenses will be treated when quota share is apportioned initially? In other words, if the council decides, for instance, that quota share from stacked licenses all needs to be put on one license, would it be inconsistent for the council then to provide a guideline for the 90-day window where transfer of quota share could be divided between more than one license?
Mr. Chairman, Mr. Twite, I think the council could certainly recommend such a provision, and it may be a way to help address some of the stacked license issues, especially when there's either agreements or contracts that would define how that quota should be redistributed between certain licenses. Beyond that, whether the council chooses to keep this 90-day window strictly for the non-AFACVs as kind of a proxy for the blended option that was developed initially, or expanded to allow other users to move quota share between licenses before it's permanently affixed to those licenses. I think that's the council's prerogative to define what the parameters are of that.
Thanks.
Mr. Merrill.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Mr. Brandon. So it seems that under this particular approach, there's probably a couple of things that we may want to be trying to accomplish by allowing this limited duration transfer. One would be to accommodate contractual agreements about the distribution of catch share that may exist between various vessel owners, LLP holders. The second would be potentially related to small amounts of quota that might be received in our process that may be assigned to, say, one LLP license, and a firm could hold multiple LLP licenses. And I guess maybe a third issue would be some other just general transfer provision that could exist for a corporation. So I guess one of the questions that I have in looking at this section is, this seems to be a fairly circumscribed potential for providing for some of those flexibilities to address some of those administrative or operational challenges. If we expand this and still keep it time limited, I guess my question to you is, what does that mean in terms of the administration of this, the implementation of this? Do we anticipate this necessarily being more complex or less complex than other programs that have had similar types of provisions?
Mr. Chairman, Mr. Merrill, I think it's a hard question in terms of the complexity relative to other things that we've done. I think as you expand the individuals that have the opportunity to use this provision, it could solve many of the issues where we have other elements in this program, like Mr. Merrill mentioned, not allocating quota share to licenses unless they meet a 0.25 to 1% threshold to receive quota shares, and all the problems John outlined with what happens if you have persons holding percentages of licenses. We could, or the council could, address those kinds of issues under this provision. And Mr. Merrill, you probably have a much better idea of the complexity for your staff to implement this type of program than I do. I would assume it would not be easy, and there would be challenges, especially when you have a certain timeline starting from the date of implementation of the final rule, and people have to finalize all these transfers within that time period, or not, and they were adjudicated later on after this period. I guess, again, it's something that I could work with your staff with, and we could try and get a better answer in terms of what the complexities, in addition to what we already have listed, whether it's more or less complex than other programs. I don't really have a great answer for you right now.
Yeah. Thank you, Mr. Brandon. I appreciate that. And I think in particular, one of the phrases that seems simple, but can be challenging based on past experience with, say, like the Halibut and Sablefish IQ program is how we measure whether or not somebody has engaged in a fish transfer agreement. What does that mean? What is the agreement? How do we measure that? Is that written? Is that oral? How do we arbitrate between various disputes that could exist? And sometimes that's particularly challenging. So I welcome your engagement with our folks on that issue. Thanks.
Mr. Twite.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. A follow-up to Mr. Merrill's question and Mr. Brandon, your answer. If there were to be a formal dispute resolution process and not something other than NIMS having to administer dispute resolution, if there were to be some formal dispute resolution process associated with this, how would that affect your answer to Mr. Merrill?
Mr. Chairman, Mr. Twite, I think all programs have to have some sort of a formal dispute process built into them. And part of that is driven by the requirements in the program that the council develops, in terms of if the council says that the owner of an LLP license at the time of harvest gets the quota share with a period at the end of that sentence, then if there are agreements between individuals that say, I, as the person who let you use my vessel or whatever, it could complicate their ability to be successful in their challenge. But I do, all these issues are always in these programs are very complicated, and there's always kind of one-off issues that really make these things difficult. But I think under any program, a person has to be allowed to challenge what their quota share allocation should be. But again, that's driven by the rules that the council puts in place in setting up this. I just feel like I'm not giving either of you very good answers, and but I think under each of these situations, if we set up a formal dispute process that say, people can come forward with agreements that would allow the transfer of quota share between licenses, regardless of the council's statement that it would be assigned to the license at the time of harvest, I think that would also alleviate some of the concerns that people may have. It probably will not eliminate all of them. If they didn't have, documentation that supports their conclusion, and as Mr. Merrill pointed out, that how we define that documentation in the dispute resolution process gets complicated as well.
Thank you.
Back to you, Mr. Brandon.
Harvest of quota share issued to processors, and under element 7.2, as I stated earlier, the National Marine Fisheries Service would create a new permit for processors, which processor allocation harvest shares would be issued and attached to. NMFS would issue a BSAI Pacific Cod processor harvest share permit to a processor and assign quota share units to that permit. the permit would be durable for the life of the program. Quota share would be non-severable, except in the one case where the council has indicated that if the purchase of one of those processor permits with quota share attached would result in the purchaser of that permit exceeding the ownership caps. My slides just changed. They would be non-severable. The permit could be transferred with all quota share if the buyer meets the criteria set by the council. Permits would be assigned to shoreside processors and can be transferred only to other shoreside processors. The provision does not include any requirement that a processor buying the permit intends to operate in the Bering Sea, Aleutian Islands, or has any other processing history of processing trawl caught Pacific cod from the BSAI. If the council wants to ensure that quota share was held by and processed by shore plants that have the capability to actually process, it could require that the buyer of the permit is held by a shore plant processor that will actually process the fish. And I think, you know, there's different ways that the council could consider achieving that goal, and as opposed to allowing someone to just go get a federal processing permit from the National Marine Fisheries Service and be able to purchase that and skirt perhaps what the intent of the council was in this provision. On an annual basis, the holder of the permit would be issued a cooperative quota that could be transferred to a CV within a cooperative. The CV operator could be affiliated with that processing plant, but may not harvest more CQ than they would have brought into the cooperative if CQ had not been issued to processors. So it gets back to that processor limit.
Ms. Baker.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Daryl, I'm noting in the analysis that when we're talking about quota share being not non-severable except in the case of exceeding ownership caps, there's an assumption that in the analysis that any quota share that is severed must be assigned to a processor permit that was initially issued to a shoreside processor with an FPP. And so that's essentially the only pool of potential recipients for that severed quota share then under the current assumption is a processor that's eligible to receive an allocation in this program. Is that correct?
Mr. Chairman, Ms. Baker, that's correct that was the assumption made in the analysis, but I think we did indicate that if that wasn't the council's intent, then they should provide direction that a new permit could be created, and some of the quota share that's severed because the buyer would have been over the cap could be attached to a new permit and essentially create a new processor permit. But given that we didn't know what the council's intent was on how that should be treated, that was our initial assumption, and we're happy to take additional direction from the council on how you'd like to see that treated in the analysis.
Okay, thank you. One follow-up, Mr. Chair, and then also during your discussion of this slide, you did mention that if the council wanted to ensure that the quota share was held and processed by shore plants, that it could consider some kind of provision that requires the permit to be held by a processor that actually would process the fish. And so you mentioned there may be a couple of different ways the council could think about that kind of provision. You do, I think, suggest one example in the analysis, but could you just review that briefly for us and also let us know if in the discussions at this meeting, if any other potential approaches have come to light?
Mr. Chairman, thank you, Ms. Baker. One of the things we looked at in the analysis is you could look at whether the processor actually had the processing capacity and ability to process the fish. And it wouldn't necessarily need to be a person firm that has processed cod in the past. It could be a totally new entrant into the cod fishery, but they would at least have to have the ability to process trawl quantities of deliveries, depending on what happens with the element 14 of cod under this program. Another element that I've heard discussed is more of a use it or lose it provision, where the processor would have to actually process the cod in X of Y years in order to retain their permit to be able to hold the cod in the future. And so those are a couple of different methodologies that I have heard or have been considered. I'm sure creative minds can think of more.
That's helpful. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thanks, Daryl.
Element 7.3 and 7.4 address the transfer of quota share between cooperatives, and this is simply restating how we typically address transfers in the North Pacific. Under element 7.3, annual cooperative quota issued to cooperatives, if it's transferred between cooperatives, must require the approval of the National Marine Fisheries Service, and that's done to ensure that NMFS can properly account for how much each cooperative is allowed to utilize during a year. Element 7.4 addresses post-delivery transfers of CQ, and so if a cooperative exceeds their cod limit or halibut limit during a year, they have until the end of the year to cover any overages to avoid potential sanctions. Mr. Chairman, I'm not sure if Ms. Baker has a question or if that's a residual.
Yeah, I'm not sure either.
Actually, Mr. Chair, I do have a new question.
Okay, great.
Thanks. I was a little slow on element 7.3. And this portion of the analysis, there is a description related to a provision in the rockfish program that the council recently adopted when it reauthorized the program. And this gets back to our discussion earlier on in this presentation about the council's consideration of, in the cooperative formation element, a minimum number of unique LLP licenses to form a cooperative. And I'm looking specifically, just to provide context, on page 240 of the analysis. And it sounds to me like, in my memory, is that for the rockfish program, the council did require a minimum number of LLP licenses, but then, as described in the PCTC analysis here, when we did the reauthorization, that minimum number of licenses required to form a cooperative was eliminated. However, there is a requirement for in-season CQ transfers can only be to a cooperative with a minimum of 2 LLP licenses. And so I'm wondering, can you help me remember a little bit of the council's discussion there? It seems to perhaps get at the issues that we were talking about earlier in this PCTC program in terms of impacts on cooperative formation versus, benefits of a cooperative program of having multiple members of the cooperative, more than maybe just one individual company or one individual person. Can you help me remember what the discussion was for rockfish program reauthorization, please?
Yeah, I will certainly try. Mr. Chairman, Ms. Baker, under the rockfish program, they didn't want to eliminate the possibility that if somebody wanted to have use the quota share they're issued by themselves without being a member of a cooperative. They had that ability, and I think it was in part to provide opportunities for individuals who either didn't want to associate with a cooperative or had a hard time being part of a cooperative for whatever reasons, giving them the ability to fish their initial allocation. What the council didn't want to occur in that situation is a person being able to acquire a lot of quota share and act as an IFQ holder within that provision. In other words, if you didn't want to act in a cooperative fashion with other people to ensure that there's no overages or there's, you want to use more fish. If you want to go off on your own and create your own little type of fishing plan, you can do that, but you're limited to what you're initially allocated, and you can't expand your footprint. And so I think it was kind of relief valve in both ways. They wanted to give people that opportunity that for whatever reason couldn't associate with other license holders in a cooperative, but they also didn't want to create an opportunity for individuals in that situation to greatly expand their fishing practices.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thanks for that clarification. I appreciate it. I'll think about that a little bit more.
Mr. Merrill.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Darrell, if you could go back to 7.4, please. Just briefly, I think really more of a note than anything. I think there's a dynamic here with post-delivery transfers, which have been a component part of all of our recent laps, and section 2.5 of the analysis. And I think it would help us perhaps in the next iteration of this, if we can have an opportunity to kind of understand what the dynamic is between allowing a post-delivery transfer and what the situation might be if we were only to allocate for the A and B season. How would we allow cooperatives to reconcile their books with a post-delivery transfer, and yet at the same time accommodate the fact that we would be making this transition from a lap to an open access fishery during a year. So I think there's some dynamics there that probably we can certainly help clarify for you as we're going forward, but I think it's something that might also benefit just public being more aware of. Thanks.
And Mr. Chairman, Mr. Merrill, I think that's an excellent point. If the program goes away at the end of the bee season and there is no more cooperative programs, how can you have transfers through the end of the year? Those kinds of issues that I think are appropriate to flesh out in a little bit more detail. And that gets back to the interplay of all these different elements that we hope to do a better job in the next version of the analysis.
Please continue.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Element 8, and this gets back, and this issue deals with the ownership and use caps for both the harvesters, processors, and vessels and processing plants. There are options that a person may not hold or use more than 5 to 10% of the CQ with an option to grandfather. I pulled the information from the analysis forward that shows if you set the limit at 5%, there's potentially 4 LOP license holders that would be over the initial ownership use cap limit. And if you increase the percentage to 10%, then depending on the option selected, there's either no one or one individual over that limit currently. Element the slides keep jumping around on me, and I'm not touching them. I don't know what it's doing. Element 8.2 deals with the vessel use cap, and the range narrowed down for consideration by the council at the last meeting is 3 to 5%. At 3%, it just is the simple calculation, the maximum consolidation that could occur without a grandfather provision under both those options. It shows the chart that's listed in the document to give people an idea of how many people are over the cap on an annual basis. And I also created a small table to the bottom right of the slide that shows if the cap was set at 3, 4, or 5%, in a given year from 2003 through 2019, at 3%, during 1 year during that period, there were a maximum of 14 vessels over the cap. At 3%, during that time period, there was 1 year when there were only 2 vessels that were over the cap, and on average, there were 9 vessels over the cap during that time period. If you increase the percentage to 5%, in any 1 year during that time period, there was a maximum of 4 vessels over the cap. Some years there was no one over the cap, and on average there was 1 vessel over the cap during the years considered. Element 8.3 is processor issued cooperative shares. And again, just a reminder that these percentages are unique to the shares that are issued to processors. This isn't combined processor and harvester issued cooperative shares. So under this case, there's options that the council considering 15 to 20% of the harvest shares that are issued to processors for the ownership and use caps. I also note that depending on the options that get selected, the council may consider exempting AI shore plants because there's options that would give them an allocation that's greater than the cap that's proposed. And the last slide is simply referring back to an earlier slide that I showed that said the top 4 processing firms account for about 75% of the targeted BSAI Pacific cod trawl processing history during the qualifying years. So on average, that's about 18 to 19% per firm. The last processing cap would be placed on the facility. So each processing plant, the limit under consideration is 20 to 30%. And I show on an annual basis what the top 4 processing plants or top 3 processing facilities did on average, and so you can see kind of the range on an annual basis how that range falls out. With that, Mr. Chairman, I will pass it back to Mr. McCracken to go through the next several elements.
Thank you, Mr. Brandon. Mr. McCracken.
Mr. Chairman, so the next slide speaks to element 9. Which are the cooperative provisions. So each cooperative would be required to file an annual application or a cooperative application to receive annual allocations. NIMS has recommended the application be submitted by November 1st to the regional administrator. This provides some time for RAM to process the applications. Amendment 80 applications are due on November 1st, and AFA applications are due on December 1st. So obviously RAM has to juggle these different application processes, and so this November 1st gives them ample time to, or at least appears to give them ample time to do that, to go through that application process. Cooperatives are formed by qualified LLP licenses with QS. Each qualified LLP license may be assigned to one cooperative. A vessel designated on a qualified LLP license is a member of that license's cooperative. Vessels not designated on a qualified LLP license and not utilizing the gear conversion may not join a cooperative. Cooperatives are not intended for coordinating harvest. Cooperatives are intended to coordinate harvest activities and are not FCMAs. And finally, on this slide, each cooperative will receive an annual CQ of cod and an apportionment of halibut and crab PSC if crab PSC is first apportioned between the 12CV and the AFACP sector. And I'll stop there for the question.
Ms. Baker.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thanks, Mr. McCracken. I have a question about the entity that's a member of the cooperative. And so it says on the slide that a vessel designated on a qualified LLP license is a member of that cooperative, but I guess so is a vessel a member of a cooperative, or is it an LLP license that are the LLP licenses form a cooperative versus vessels under this program?
I mean, the cooperative formation in element 1 would say that that holders of qualified LLP licenses joining cooperative annuals. So it is the LLP license and the QS assigned to those LLP licenses that join a cooperative, and vessels that are not designated on a trawl CV qualified LLP license are not eligible. So I would interpret that language to mean that the LLP license, the eligible LLP license that authorizes that vessel to participate would also be a member of that cooperative. If that gets at what you're trying to answer or seeking information on, Ms. Baker.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chair. And it may just be my lack of familiarity with the details of how a cooperative operates. I can follow up later and maybe get a little more clarification on that. Thanks, Mr. Chair.
Ms. Baker, may I jump in and answer the question, help answer the question too? My understanding is that cooperatives are formed by the holders of LLP licenses that have quota share for the COD program attached. When the annual application is submitted to form the cooperative to the National Marine Fisheries Service, the cooperative members identify the licenses or the vessels that will be allowed to harvest cooperative shares within the cooperative. And so the cooperative is formed by the LLP license holders, and it's those individuals that identify which vessels will be allowed to harvest the cooperative quota on an annual basis by identifying them in their annual cooperative allocation. And I think if people want to go back and kind of refer to the Rockfish program cooperative application, it kind of lays that out in a fairly easy to follow format.
Thank you, Gerald. Thanks, Mr. Chair. That's very helpful.
Okay, thanks. I think we're ready to continue.
All right, so element 10 is the share duration. This MSA in section 303A states that the LAP permit is limited to no more than 10 years. That will be renewed prior to expiration unless revoked or limited or modified. So the default is that NMFS would renew the permits under the proposed action without council initiating a formal analysis to authorize the program. The next element is monitoring, and I would hold off on presenting this slide as well as the going through the monitoring program. And we're going to allow Ms. Abidjan to provide both an overview of the element 11 as well as the effects section after the SIA is presented. The final element 12 that I would present before we get to element 13 and 14 is reporting and program review. This slide is broken down into two sections, the annual cooperative reporting and the program review. The annual cooperative report is something that we currently do with a number of our different LAP programs at the April meeting. This cooperative report that would be associated with this program obviously must comply with the Paperwork Reduction Act. Cooperative reports are obviously a resource for the council to track and gauge the effectiveness of the cooperative program and whether it's meeting their goals, the council's goals in establishing this program. It's also a avenue for the cooperatives to report back to the council on feedback and the success and changes to the program to better reflect what the council's goals were when they originally set up the program. Table starting on page 265 includes a summary of the current reporting requirements for the existing cooperative reports, and there are again a number of those, along with the PRA authorization information. The final element or the final bullet on this slide talks about program review, and this would, barring any changes by the council, the Magnuson Act requires that a detailed formal program review to be undertaken after 5 years of implementation of this program, with additional reviews at a minimum of 7 years thereafter. And Mr. Chairman, if there's no questions on this element, I will hand it back to Darrell, who will walk us through element 13 and element 14.
Don't see any. Mr. Brandon.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Element 13 is brief. Section 304D2 of the MSA requires that LAP programs have a cost recovery fee program that is limited to 3% of the ex-vessel value of the allocated species. In this program, the only species that has an ex-vessel value that we're allocating is Pacific cod. And we've added a discussion to this section, maybe to simplify the process and eliminate redundancy with other data collections that we do for cost recovery. And so we're recommending now, or the Natural and Fisheries Service is recommending using the existing cod ex-vessel volume and value reports, which are component of Amendment 80 in the CDQ groundfish cost recovery programs, and just use those same prices for the PCTC program. That will eliminate the need for an additional data collection mechanism under this program.
Ms. Campbell.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I apologize. I have a question about something else for Darrell, but I missed the boat, and so I kind of have no choice but to ask it now. So I'm trying to reconcile tables 2-127 and 2-128, and so I'm back on the part of the analysis that has to do with processing quota. And so I don't know what the best time to bring this up is, but since I'm already talking, Darrell, so table 2-128 was included in the slides, and it's where you have the processors broken into quartiles, and there's the top 4, 5 through 8, 9 through 12, and then the bottom 4 to 6, which to me would imply there's somewhere between 16 and 18 total processors. But if you go back to 2-127, for example, if we use 2009 to 2019 for qualifying years and excluded the sea season, I see a total of 12 processors. So I'm just wondering if you can help me reconcile those two tables at some point.
Certainly. 12 and 13. And Madam, Mr. Chairman, Ms. Campbell, I believe the issue deals with the entry and exit and how I decided my assumption of who would qualify. And so under the table 2-127, and 2-128, I will have to go back and double check. It's not jumping out to me right now, but I think it goes back to my assumptions regarding the qualification of processors and processors who are no longer active in the fishery, especially some of the movement between processing entities that were in the Aleutian Islands, whether I included them or not in the calculations. But that's something I'll go back and double check, and I'll let you know for sure after I get back up after public testimony.
Okay, thank you very much, Daryl, and I apologize again for asking so out of order on that one. Thanks.
No, that's perfectly fine. Oops. Element 14 is gear conversion, and we have a few slides on this issue simply because of the uniqueness of it and where we are in the process. Element 14 allows Bering Sea Aleutian Islands cod trawl catcher vessels cooperative quota to be harvested using pot gear. Trawl CVs that are members of the cooperative don't need to have a pot endorsement or a fixed gear endorsement on their license in order to harvest the cod with pot gear. It would also allow pot CVs to be associated with the cooperative and harvest the cooperative quota. The vessel would not be required to have a pot gear endorsement on the LLP license. And when we say pot gear endorsement in the Bering Sea Aleutian Islands, there are pot gear endorsements that are specifically associated with gear types. The general gear endorsement on LLP licenses are trawl and non-trawl, as you're all well aware. It's only for the Pacific cod fishery where there's a specific pot endorsement listed. And so as we walk through this, my assumption, I talk about vessels that have endorsements for the Pacific cod pot fishery, but I also talk about licenses in general that have an area endorsement for the Bering Sea Aleutian Islands. And so based on 2021 LLP license file, there are currently 50 CV LLP licenses that are endorsed to fish Bering Sea or Aleutian Islands for Pacific cod with pot gear. There are a total of 47 LLP licenses that are only endorsed for the Bering Sea. 2 are endorsed for both the Bering Sea and Aleutian Islands, and 1 is only endorsed for the Aleutian Islands. None of the trawl CV LLP licenses with a Bering Sea or Aleutian Island endorsement that would qualify for this program have a Pacific cod pot endorsement currently on their license for the Bering Sea or Aleutian Islands. And as I said, because the motion doesn't require an LLP license to have a Pacific cod pot gear endorsement, any LLP license not subject to other use restrictions, in other words, be on a CP, could be eligible to join the cooperative if given access to cooperative quota. Table 2-142 shows the number of LLP licenses with gear endorsements by area. Some of the licenses in that table are associated with CPs, either AFA or Amendment 80, and they wouldn't be allowed to participate. But overall, the table shows that potentially there are a few hundred LLP licenses that could potentially be used in the PCTC program to fish with pot gear, given that all you have to do is have a Bering Sea or Aleutian Islands area endorsement, essentially, to be able to utilize the program. The number of vessels that will use gear conversion provision is unknown. It is assumed that most trawl CVs will continue to harvest their own CQ or lease it to other trawl CVs in the program. leasing to vessels using pot gear may be most likely to occur when an initial quota shareholder also owns a vessel that fishes with pot gear, has a close association with a vessel operator that uses pot gear, or they are able to derive greater economic benefit from leasing to a vessel using pot gear compared to harvesting the quota themselves with their trawl gear, has a small allocation that would not allow for a trawl trip, or if the halibut PSE limits are anticipated to constrain the harvest of cod by the trawl CV sector at some point during the year. For in-season management to correctly account for the cod program landings, it'll be necessary to establish a notification to identify whether a vessel is in the PCTC program cooperative and what gear is being used. Enforcement would need documentation of whether a vessel may legally fish cooperative quota with pot gear. Bering Sea cod catch by vessels using trawl or pot gear when fishing the PCTC program would be deducted from that cooperative's allocation. In other words, and there was some discussion of this in the AP and other places, any catch that's made under the PCTC program is deducted from that program's allocation, including PSC. If a vessel is using pot gear, is not fishing in the PCTC program, the vessel would still be required to have a pot gear endorsement on the LLP license to fish in the BSAI pot cod fishery when it's opened. It doesn't affect any other fisheries outside of the cod that's allocated under the PCTC program. And since sector allocations are not altered in this gear conversion element, quota cannot be permanently converted to the pot sector. However, there wouldn't be any prohibition on a person that owns a pot vessel from buying a license and essentially using that permanently to harvest with pot gear. Allowing quota holders the flexibility to use pot gear may enable them to reduce halibut PSC usage. Table 2-143 and 2-144 provide a summary of PSC mortality in the Bering Sea Aleutian Islands cod fishery for trawl CVs, and it also provides information for pot CVs in the greater than 60-foot sector. Table 2-145 provides annual and average bycatch rates of crab species for non-pelagic trawl and pot gears. Pot gear has a lower halibut mortality rate, but a higher crab mortality rate and bycatch rate. There's no halibut PSE mortality assigned to the pot gear sector. It's currently exempt from halibut PSE limits. However, we do know that pot gear DMR for halibut is calculated at 27%.
Mr. Merrill.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Mr. Brannon. If you could step back one slide, please. I just wanted to make sure that the staff assumption about which LLP licenses could be used is consistent with what I think you were saying. So my understanding is that if a person held an LLP license, they would be able to use pot gear under this provision. However, they would still be subject to the area endorsements that exist on that license, would still be subject to the maximum length overall provisions that exist on that LLP license, but would not necessarily need to hold, say, a non-trawl endorsed LLP license to be able to participate in the pot gear conversion. Is that correct?
Mr. Merrill, that's correct. And I briefly touched on in my presentation that there is a kind of a fish down provision in the LLP program where the maximum length overall you can use on smaller vessels. And so all those endorsements that are applied to an LLP license must be met in terms of area and so forth and length. They just don't have to have the pot endorsement to fish cod in the Bering Sea if they're in the gear conversion portion of the cooperative. Thank you. We note in the analysis that the council should provide specific direction on if vessels taking Pacific Cod trips using pot gear will have different monitoring requirements. The underlying assumption, and based on what the council's motion is we think that they do, and they typically have to have 100% observer coverage and to accurately account for quota harvest. There was just a question raised when we were going through by the team and analytical process just to verify that. But our assumption, unless directed otherwise, is they have to meet all the monitoring and requirements that would be placed on the trawl vessels in the fishery. Electronic monitoring could possibly be available for pot vessels prior to EM program for the trawl sector. However, there remains a lot of uncertainty regarding the timing of when EM programs will be fully implemented, and I know you had a detailed discussion of this yesterday. Section 2.7.11 is provided for more detailed information on the monitoring enforcement of the PCTC program, and NIMS staff will be available to speak in more detail later in our presentation. Gear conversion could have implications on where fishing occurs in terms of state and federal waters, including the potential for interactions with vessels currently using pot gear and hook and line gear. Gear interactions may be greatest based on past year's distribution of Pacific cod in the Bering Sea area north of Unimak Island, where vessels focus their fishing effort for Pacific cod or Pacific cod congregate. The species composition of landings in the directed Pacific cod fishery differs between pot gear vessels and vessels using trawl gear. Pot gear tends to be more selective, with groundfish catches being almost all Pacific cod. The discard mortality rates of some species taking incidentally when using Pacific cod gear is lower, or pot gear is lower than when using trawl gear. Trawl gear vessels tend to have a higher incidental catches of flatfish and pollock in the Pacific cod fishery. If the PCTC program cooperative quota is harvested with pot gear, it may only be harvested by CVs deploying pot gear. In other words, the gear conversion does not extend to pot CPs. CVs that are less than 60 foot length overall and greater than 60 feet length overall could be allowed to use pot gear to harvest CQ with approval from a cooperative, even though those two classes of pot gear vessels fish off different allocations in their directed pot fishery. The council clarified that the start date for the fishery for vessels using either pot gear or trawl gear is the January 20th start date for the trawl fishery when they're fishing under the cooperative program. And with that, I will turn it over to Mr. McCracken, unless there are questions.
Ms. Kimball has a question.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, Mr. Brannon. I think it's back on your first slide under this element, slide 60, but we have a lot of written comment, and I'm sure we'll hear about it in public testimony, but I first wanted to get your impression or what's provided in the analysis between the difference of requiring that the pot licenses associated with this provision, is the requirement how we've already written it such that they are members of the cooperative or that they are associated with the cooperative? And can you tell me how you see the difference in the two things? Clearly, we have a motion that requires all CV licenses to create the cooperative. And so I note here you use the word associated, and I wanted to understand better if there was a distinction there that I was missing.
Mr. Chairman, Ms. Kimball, the way I understand that this program would work if gear conversion were included would be much as we talked about earlier. Any PCTC cooperative would be formed by holders of LLP licenses that have quota share attached to them. They would be the members of the cooperative that define the cooperative structure, the rules of the cooperative, and basically define all those issues. There would be a processor associated with the cooperative. There would be vessels associated with the cooperative that would be allowed to harvest the Pacific cod. Those vessels that are associated with the cooperative and that must be identified in the annual application for the cooperative to be allowed to harvest any of the CQ, whether it's with trawl gear or pot gear, would have to be identified in the cooperative application. And those vessels, if they're using pot gear, would have to have a license associated with them with the appropriate area and length endorsements, as Mr. Merrill and I discussed earlier, in order to be able to fish within the pot cooperative or Pacific cod cooperative with pot gear.
Thank you, Daryl. Thanks, Mr.
Thanks, Ms. Kimball. Further questions? Okay. Well, I'm going to postpone Mr. McCracken's thunder here a little bit and go ahead and call for our lunch break. Do about 45 minutes again. Come back at 12:35 Alaska time.